There is a moment at the end of every game when the world becomes quiet in a way that does not feel natural. The crowd drains away. The lights soften. The field, torn and scattered with the marks of collision, becomes a quiet battlefield that no longer belongs to the men who fought on it. I have stood in that silence many times. It is a silence that carries weight. It settles on the shoulders like an invisible reminder that nothing about this sport lasts forever. The cheers fade. The adrenaline leaves. What remains is the truth that every player must face alone. At some point, every career begins its final season long before the player realizes it. I have watched men walk onto a field full of confidence and leave as strangers to themselves. I have watched the strongest players in the league move with the slow, unsteady steps of someone who just learned that the body is no longer willing to do what the mind demands. The transformation does not happen all at once. It arrives in fragments. A missed step, a slow recovery. A pain that lingers a little too long. A breath that takes a moment too many to return. Most fans never notice these moments. They see the highlights. They replay the touchdowns. They admire the strength and speed. What they never see is the quiet collapse that happens inside a player who realizes he is beginning his final season without knowing it. Some players fall from the game because of one violent moment. A hit that sends them into a fog. A twist that ends a ligament. A collision that changes their vision. Those endings are dramatic. Crowds remember them. But there is another kind of ending that is quieter and far more devastating. It happens to the players who give everything for a team that demands more than any one man should ever have to give. It happens to the players who are asked to fill every role because the team sees them as the answer to every emergency. It happens to the men who believe that doing more will save their career, only to discover that doing more is the very thing that destroys it. This story begins in that silence after the crowd leaves. It begins in the space where the stadium feels too large for one man and his thoughts. In that space, the truth becomes impossible to avoid. There are players who walk through that tunnel and know they are not the same person who arrived a few years earlier. The time has passed too quickly. The cost has arrived too late. The body carries the evidence even when the mind does not want to accept it. This is the story of a man who played every position because no one else would. He played everywhere because he believed loyalty mattered. He played everywhere because coaches praised his toughness and his willingness to sacrifice. He played everywhere because he thought it would earn him security in a league that offers very little to anyone who is not a star. He played everywhere because it felt like the only way to stay on the field. Every snap felt like survival. Every role felt like another chance to prove that he belonged. The tragedy is that belonging was the very thing he lost in the process. Some players are born into one position. They grow into it. They study it. They become masters of a single craft. This man was never given that luxury. From the beginning, he was everything the team needed and nothing he could call his own. Running back one week, safety the next. Slot receiver when injuries piled up. Special teams every single game. He became the man coaches relied on when the roster fell apart. He never complained. He never resisted the assignments. He stepped into roles that were designed for other bodies, other skill sets, other men. Every time he did, he paid a physical price that the fans never saw and the statistics never recorded. The first time he filled in at a position he had not practiced that week, he did it because he believed in the idea of team. That moment changed the rest of his life. The coaches noticed his adaptability. They noticed his willingness to put the team before himself. That willingness became the reason he was asked to do it again, and again, and again. His identity began to dissolve. Instead of being a player with a defined future, he became a solution to everyone else's crisis. He became the man who did everything. The quiet truth was that doing everything meant he no longer owned anything that protected him. There are stories told behind closed doors of players who carried a team through impossible moments, only for the team to forget them when their usefulness ran out. There are stories of players who gave more than they should have, only to leave the league with nothing but pain and regret. This man belongs to that forgotten group, the group that is celebrated for its versatility but not remembered for its sacrifice. The group that is praised for its toughness but left behind when the injuries accumulate. The group that enters the league believing that effort is everything, only to discover that effort is what the league uses until the player breaks. The final season for a player like this is not filled with ceremonies or celebrations. It begins quietly. It begins with a lingering ache that will not leave. It begins with a moment when he stands on the sideline and realizes that the younger players are faster, fresher, and protected in ways he never was. It begins when he sees that the coaches no longer look in his direction when discussing the future. The final season is not marked by a clock. It is marked by the unmistakable feeling that the game has already moved on, even though he is still standing on the field. I remember watching him in that final season. He played through injuries that would have placed other players on the sideline for weeks. He lined up in positions he had no business playing because the team needed someone who would not question the assignment. He pushed through pain that threatened to pull him apart. Every game became a test, not of skill, but of survival. Every snap became a reminder that he was fighting a battle he could not win, and yet he fought it. Not because he believed he could save his career, but because he did not know how to stop giving everything he had. When the end finally arrived, it came without warning. One moment he was playing through the chaos of the season. The next, he was staring at a future he never prepared for. The game did not thank him. The game did not explain what came next. The game simply closed the door and moved forward. He was left in the silence that follows when everything you built your life around disappears. He had played every position. He had given every part of himself. And in the end, he had nothing left to hold on to. This is the story of the man who did everything and lost everything. It is not a story of failure. It is a story of sacrifice and consequence. It is a story that reveals the unforgiving nature of a league that rewards specialization but uses versatility as a temporary fix. It is a story that forces us to confront the truth that some players are not broken by one hit, but by a lifetime of being the answer to problems they never created. This is the beginning. The deeper truth waits ahead. When you study the history of football closely enough, you begin to notice the patterns that hide beneath the surface. You see how the sport has always rewarded the men who could dominate one position with absolute mastery. Quarterbacks who read the field with uncanny precision. Receivers who turned small windows into long runs. Linebackers who sense plays before they happen. Football evolved around specialists. The league was built on the idea that perfection in one role separates the great from the ordinary. Yet in the shadows of this system exists a rare and complicated figure. The player who is asked to be more than one thing. The player who is told to adapt in ways the league publicly celebrates but privately punishes. The player who can fill any role but belongs to none. Across the decades, only a handful of names ever rose into the spotlight as true multi-position athletes. Chuck Bednarik anchored both offense and defense during an era when the league demanded iron toughness from its players. Deion Sanders moved between cornerback and wide receiver with a grace that seemed effortless. Julian Edelman shifted from college quarterback to professional receiver and punt returner, embodying a modern transformation. Emergency quarterbacks stepped in during moments of crisis. Utility players found temporary glory when a roster fell apart. Two-way athletes appeared in the earliest years when the league had fewer rules, fewer protections, and a smaller pool of talent. These stories are compelling, but they are rare for a reason. Playing multiple positions requires a level of physical resilience, mental endurance, and emotional strain that the public rarely understands. For every famous multi-position player known by name, there are dozens of forgotten ones. Men who gave their bodies to a system that absorbed their versatility without offering long-term security. Men who moved across the field because no one else could or would. Men who never had the opportunity to specialize and build a career around one identity. The league thrives on specialization because it creates structure. The man who can do everything threatens that structure in subtle ways. He becomes the answer to injuries, roster gaps, and strategic emergencies. The team values his adaptability, but they value it as a temporary solution rather than a foundation. When he is needed, he is praised. When he breaks, he is replaced. The culture of football has always demanded sacrifice. Every player learns early that the body is a currency and the game will collect its due. Pain is normalized. Exhaustion is romanticized. Toughness is measured not by how well a player performs at full strength, but by how effectively he performs while hurting. Coaches talk about next man up, but they seldom speak about the hidden cost of the players who fill that role repeatedly. In this environment, the versatile player becomes both an asset and a victim. He is often the first man called when something goes wrong. He steps in because he believes it matters. He steps in because he wants to prove himself. He steps in because he does not want to lose his place on the team. Over time, stepping in becomes his identity, even though it slowly removes the chance to build a stable future. There is an emotional toll that accompanies this kind of existence. Football is already a sport that tests the limits of human endurance. When you layer multiple positions across the same body and mind, the strain grows exponentially. Each position requires a different skill set, a different mentality, a different way of reading the game, a different pattern of movements and impacts. The body absorbs collisions that come from angles meant for entirely different roles. The mind processes complex playbooks written for athletes who have years of consistency in one position. The spirit endures the feeling of being essential, yet replaceable at the same time. The pressure never relents. The expectations never soften. The man who tries to hold everything together discovers eventually that he cannot hold himself together. This documentary focuses on one such man, a player who entered the league believing that adaptability would be his gift and his guarantee. He believed that proving his value in multiple positions would secure his future. He believed that doing more than anyone else would protect his career. He believed that stepping into every role the team asked of him would build trust. He learned the truth slowly and painfully. The more he gave, the more the system took. The more he stepped in, the more he was expected to continue stepping in. The more roles he filled, the harder it became for anyone to define him at all. He became the man who could do everything, which eventually meant he was the man who did not fully belong anywhere. His story began long before his first professional snap. Coaches in high school marveled at his ability to adapt. In college, he shifted positions whenever the team required it, earning admiration but losing the chance to develop mastery in one role. Scouts praised his athleticism but struggled to categorize him. Teams saw potential but lacked vision. His draft evaluation was a reflection of the same contradiction. He was versatile but undefined, valuable but uncertain. Teams liked him, but never enough to commit to a clear, long-term plan. He entered the league eager to prove himself and immediately walked into the same pattern that had followed him for years. The team saw him as the solution to their weekly problems, not as a player to be carefully developed. In the broader history of the sport, versatility is often framed as a heroic trait. The media celebrates players who step into unexpected roles. Fans cheer when a receiver becomes an emergency quarterback or when a defensive player catches a critical pass. Analysts talk about football intelligence and team-first mentality, but they rarely discuss the long-term impact. They do not examine how the body wears down when forced to adapt to conflicting demands. They do not explore the psychological toll of never settling into a role that offers security. They do not acknowledge how the league benefits from these players while offering little in return once the damage is done. This man's story reveals the other side of that narrative. His versatility became a trap disguised as opportunity. The more he tried to secure his place, the more he slipped into a role that drained him. He played through injuries that were never fully healed. He learned multiple playbooks, while others learned one. He shouldered responsibilities that were meant to be divided across an entire roster. Eventually, the weight became too heavy. His final season arrived quietly, the way it does for many players. Not with a catastrophic injury, but with a gradual accumulation of strain that could no longer be hidden. He could still run, but not with the same sharpness. He could still hit, but the recovery took longer. He could still think through the assignments, but the mental fatigue clouded the edges. The final collapse of his career was not dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and irreversible. The league that had relied on him simply replaced him. No ceremony, no recognition, no gratitude. Just a silent shift in the depth chart that confirmed his role had been temporary all along. When he left the game, he carried injuries that would last the rest of his life. He carried regret for the roles he accepted. He carried the heavy truth that doing everything cost him everything. This documentary will walk through his journey one chapter at a time. It will examine the emotional and physical layers that defined his experience. It will explore the historical context that shaped his trajectory. It will investigate the culture of sacrifice that pushed him to give more than he could afford. It will reveal the systemic pressures that turned versatility into vulnerability. His story is not just his own. 'Tis a reflection of the hidden machinery of a league that rewards the few and extracts from the many. This is the foundation. The journey begins now. I have always believed that a player's story begins long before the bright lights and the stadium noise. It starts in the places where the world is small enough for dreams to feel reachable. For him, that place was a quiet neighborhood where the evenings smelled like cut grass and where the echo of a ball hitting pavement could carry through the entire block. Long before the league knew his name, long before coaches would marvel at his ability to play any position placed before him, he was simply a kid who could not sit still because movement felt like life itself. He played everything he could get his hands on. Baseball in the spring, football in the fall, pick-up basketball whenever the rim in the driveway was free. There are stories from those early years of him racing adults just to see how much faster he could grow. His teachers remembered him as the boy who finished his work first because he could not wait to return to the makeshift field outside. His family remembers him as the kid who saw a ball, not as an object, but as a permission slip to possibility. The first sign of unusual talent was not a single moment, but a pattern that appeared before anyone realized what it meant. When his youth football team needed a running back, he ran. When they needed a quarterback, he threw. When they needed a safety, he read the field with a precocious understanding that stunned the adults around him. He made it look easy, and at that age, easy feels like destiny. His coaches thought they were seeing potential. What they were actually seeing was the beginning of a life shaped by being able to do everything asked of him, and the expectation that he always would. Most children are steered into a single lane. They are told to find their strength and follow it. He never had that conversation. His strength was everywhere. He was big enough to block, fast enough to catch, smart enough to read plays before they unfolded. By the time he reached middle school, he was the player everyone talked about. He was the one who made highlight moments look like routine plays. But inside that admiration was a quiet truth. When everyone believes you can do everything, they start to believe you should do everything. When a player does not learn early what his limits are, the world has a way of deciding he does not have any. His high school years became the first test of that narrative. Unlike most kids who were slotted into defined roles, he stepped onto a team where every coach saw a different version of him. The offensive coordinator saw a future star receiver. The defensive coach saw the best cornerback on the roster. The special teams coach was convinced he had the most gifted returner he had ever coached. In a system built on specialization, he became the exception that made everyone rethink their assumptions. Each Friday night, he would line up wherever the team needed him most. Wide out for one drive, linebacker for another, quarterback when the starter was injured. His teammates joked that the only position he had not played was marching band. He would smile and shake his head. But even then, there were signs of something deeper happening. He played because he loved the game, but he also played because he did not want to let anyone down. There is a subtle difference between joy and obligation. For him, the line between the two began to blur before he even realized it. Coaches praised him for his ability to adapt. Players leaned on him during every crisis. Recruiters saw him as a rare weapon who could fill any gap. But the pressure that came with it was invisible, the kind that builds slowly over time until a player forgets what he actually wants. The burden of being the one who can do everything is that people stop asking what you should do. The first real crack appeared during a playoff game in his junior year. Their quarterback went down early, and without hesitation, every head turned toward him. He walked onto the field, took the snap, and led the team as if he had been preparing for that moment his entire life. He made it work because that is what he did best. But afterward, in the quiet moment when the locker room emptied, he sat alone with his jersey still clinging to his skin and admitted for the first time that he was tired. Not physically tired, but emotionally stretched thin. He would never say it to a coach or teammate, us. He would never show weakness. But he felt the weight of being everything to everyone. It was a moment that passed as quickly as it came, but it planted a seed that would grow in ways he could not yet understand. College recruiters saw only the surface. They saw a young man with a highlight reel that crossed 3 phases of the game. They saw the rare kind of athlete who could change the structure of a roster. Some offered him positions, others offered him possibilities. Only a few asked what he wanted. And even then, he gave the answer he thought he was supposed to give. He told them he would do whatever the team needed. It was a noble sentiment. It was also the beginning of the identity that would follow him into the league and eventually define his downfall. His family knew he was special, but they also knew the pressure that came with that label. His mother once said that he learned to be responsible before he learned to be selfish. It was meant as praise, but in hindsight, it reveals a truth about his character. A player who never chooses himself is a player the system can easily consume. By the time he graduated high school, he had already lived a career's worth of expectations. He was the reliable one, the flexible one, the one who stepped up whenever someone else went down. That reputation, once it attaches itself to a promising athlete, becomes difficult to escape. His transition to college marked the moment when his potential met the machinery of the sport. At the collegiate level, versatility is both celebrated and exploited. Coaches love players who can solve roster problems. He arrived with talent and humility. He left with something far more complicated. During his freshman year, he was shifted from offense to defense and back again as injuries mounted and depth charts shifted. He adjusted because that was what he had always done. Every time he succeeded, it reinforced the idea that he could handle more. Every time he struggled, it was dismissed because he would eventually figure it out. But privately, he began to question whether he was building a career or simply patching holes that were never meant to be his. There is a moment in every athlete's life when the future begins to reveal its shape. For him, that moment was deceptively small. It happened during a spring practice when the defensive backs coach pulled him aside and told him he could become all-conference at corner if he committed to the position. A week later, the offensive coordinator told him he could be the most dangerous slot receiver in the conference if he chose that path instead. 2 conflicting promises, both sincere, both compelling. Instead of choosing a direction, he chose to keep helping wherever he was needed. It felt noble at the time. In truth, it was the beginning of the trap he would spend the rest of his career trying to escape. His early promise was undeniable. His talent was unquestioned. But the real story is not that he could do everything. It is that he learned too early that his value came from doing everything. Once the league learns that about a player, it rarely lets him forget it. Every college recruit enters the system with a title stamped onto their identity: quarterback, wide, receiver, linebacker, safety. It is how the sport makes sense of potential. It is how coaches decide who belongs where and why. But when he arrived on campus for the first time, there was a different kind of conversation happening behind closed doors. He was the recruit who did not fit a position, the one scouts had written paragraphs about because a single word could not contain what they saw. He was tall enough to play receiver, strong enough to play safety, fast enough to run with special teams, and instinctive enough to slide into a hybrid role that had not even been defined yet. Most recruits want clarity. He walked into an environment where clarity was the one thing no one could offer. The first weeks of college football are a test of identity. Players fight to prove they are more than just potential on paper. He was thrown into a depth chart where no one knew exactly where he should line up. During early practices, he wore 3 different jersey colors in a single week. One day, he was running routes with receivers. The next, he was backpedaling with defensive backs. The next, he was in a room with special teams coaches reviewing coverage lanes. For a typical freshman, that much movement would have been overwhelming. For him, it triggered something familiar. It felt like being home again, where every corner of the field was part of his domain. Yet there was an undercurrent beneath that initial comfort. College was not high school. Here, every position group demanded mastery. Every coach demanded specialization. The margins were thinner, the competition sharper, and the consequences of inconsistency far more real. He was not being asked to fill gaps temporarily. He was being evaluated as a solution to multiple problems. And solutions, once discovered, are rarely allowed to rest. There were moments in those first practices when teammates watched him do things that seemed impossible for a freshman still learning a new playbook. One afternoon, he jumped a route in a 7-on-7 drill with the timing of a senior starter. That same day, he took a rep at slot receiver and made a cut so sudden that the defensive coordinator stopped practice to replay the film. The footage showed a player with unusual fluidity, someone who understood leverage like a defensive back, but moved with the spontaneity of an offensive weapon. The coaches were impressed. But instead of agreeing where he belonged, they began to argue. The defensive staff wanted him exclusively. They believed he could become an elite cornerback with time and discipline. The offensive coordinator insisted his agility and spatial intelligence made him a natural receiver. The head coach saw the potential for a rare two-way player. And special teams, always overlooked until something goes wrong, made their pitch as well. They saw a gunner who could flip field position and a returner who could turn broken plays into electricity. In a single week, he had become the most desired player in the building, not because of what he was, but because of all he might be. But inside that excitement was the first hint of instability. A player who belongs everywhere often belongs nowhere. A player who can do anything is rarely given ownership of one thing. As the season approached, he found himself studying multiple playbooks, attending extra meetings, and splitting his time between position groups that each believed they deserved more of his attention. He did not complain. He absorbed everything. But the pace was relentless, and the demands were unlike anything he had faced before. Each group trained him differently. Each coach spoke a different language. Instead of sharpening one skill set, he was spreading himself thin across several. The first game of the season highlighted both the promise and the problem. He lined up as a receiver on the opening drive, caught a quick slant, and muscled his way to a first down. The stadium noticed, the bench erupted. But on the next defensive series, an injury forced him into a cornerback role. Without hesitation, he jogged onto the field and held his own against a veteran receiver. Later, on special teams, he sprinted downfield on coverage and made a tackle that shifted momentum. 3 phases. 1 player, 1 night. It was the kind of performance that makes coaches rethink the boundaries of the sport. It was also the beginning of a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his career. When he succeeded in multiple roles, the staff praised his adaptability. When he made mistakes, those mistakes were attributed to inexperience at whichever role he had played least that week. The responsibility was his, but the structure around him gave him no chance to settle into a rhythm. And slowly, quietly, the sense of positional instability began to grow. His teammates noticed the exhaustion before he did. During mid-season film sessions, he often appeared in multiple clips from different angles and different units. He was the only player who spent time in 3 meeting rooms every week. There were days when he would leave defensive back drills only to jog to the offensive side of the field to practice red zone patterns. Those are words players long to hear. But in college football, indispensable often means expendable in a different way. It means a player can be stretched until the breaking point without anyone realizing there is a breaking point. The turning point came during a rivalry game late in the season. A wide receiver went down with an ankle injury, and he was moved to offense full-time for the night. He excelled immediately. He caught 6 passes, broke multiple tackles, and scored a touchdown that sent the stadium into chaos. It was the kind of game that recruits dream of. But instead of securing his identity as a receiver, it created another debate. The defensive coordinator was furious that he had lost access to a player he believed was becoming the best corner on the roster. The head coach began discussing the possibility of formalizing him as a two-way contributor. And special teams, seeing his playmaking ability blossom, insisted that he remain a core part of coverage and returns. In the chaos of success, something human went unnoticed. After the game, he sat in the locker room with a towel over his head, long after most players had showered and left. He was proud, but also unsure. He had no idea which room he was supposed to report to the next morning. He had no sense of which role he was expected to master next. Every direction pulled at him, and none offered stability. It was the first moment he wondered if being the player who could do everything meant he would never get to choose who he wanted to become. His sophomore year only deepened the uncertainty. Instead of narrowing his focus, coaches expanded it. He became a utility piece, a movable part in a machine that was always shifting. Some weeks he was primarily a defender. Other weeks he was an offensive contributor. Often he was both. His body adapted, but at a cost that would only become clear years later. Constant role changes meant constant physical adjustments. His workload was heavier than anyone admitted. And while he continued to shine, the foundation beneath him was already beginning to fracture. By the time he reached the end of his college career, he had built a reputation as one of the most versatile players in the conference. Scouts labeled him as a rare Swiss Army knife. Analysts praised his football intelligence. Coaches admired his willingness to serve the team in any capacity. But underneath those compliments was a truth that would define his professional journey. He was entering the NFL without a position. Not because he lacked talent, but because no one had ever given him the space to grow into one identity. He had become a player who fit everywhere, and therefore fit nowhere. The instability that began in college would follow him into the league. Shaping a career built on adaptation but lacking the foundation that every long-term player needs. Draft day is supposed to be a moment of clarity. It is the culmination of years of preparation, sacrifice, and belief. It is the day a player finally learns where he belongs in the professional world. But for him, the experience felt more like standing in the middle of a shifting landscape where the ground moved every time someone asked a new question. The very quality that had once made him a prized recruit was now the source of hesitation. Teams knew he could play. They were not sure where. In the weeks leading up to the draft, he visited multiple franchises for individual workouts. Each team treated him differently. One club asked him to run receiver drills exclusively. Another lined him up as a cornerback for an entire afternoon. A third asked him to work on special teams coverage, as if his speed and aggression made him a natural fit for that phase. The meetings were polite, professional, and full of praise. But he could sense something underneath the surface every time the coaches exchanged looks. They saw potential, but not definition. Promise, but not certainty. And certainty is the currency of the draft. The scouting reports reflected that confusion. Analysts were fascinated by him. Some compared him to the rare two-way players from the earliest decades of the league. Others mentioned modern hybrids who had carved out roles by doing a little bit of everything. One report described him as a physical marvel with instincts that translated across multiple positions. Another praised his football intelligence, noting how quickly he learned new assignments and adapted to unfamiliar roles. But nearly all of them included the same question: what is he in the NFL? The reports could list strengths and measurable traits, but they struggled to label him with a single identity. That lack of clarity placed him in a strange category. Teams love versatility, but only when it complements a primary role. When a player enters the league without a defined position, he becomes difficult to place on a depth chart. Coaches want a clear pathway for development. General managers want to know how a pick fits into the long-term structure of the roster. His file was full of possibilities, but light on singular direction. It made him intriguing, but also risky in the eyes of certain franchises. Some evaluators even wondered whether he had been moved around too much in college to reach his full potential at one spot. It was as if the very thing that set him apart also held him back. On the morning of the draft, he sat with his family, friends, and a small circle of supporters who had watched his journey unfold from childhood to college. They believed the league would see what they saw: a rare competitor who thrived wherever the game placed him. A player who had the intelligence to learn quickly and the physicality to compete immediately. But he woke with an uneasiness he had never felt before. It was not fear or doubt. It was uncertainty. He did not know whether teams viewed him as a receiver, a cornerback, a safety, or a special teams specialist. He did not know whether they saw him as a valuable asset or a developmental project. It was as if the future waiting for him that day was hidden behind multiple doors, and he would not know which one opened until his name was called. The early rounds came and went. Star players filled the screen. Prospects with clear positions and clear projections found their homes. He watched the names scroll by, knowing he deserved to be among them. Each pick held a moment of hope, followed by a quiet disappointment when the selection belonged to someone else. His family remained supportive, offering smiles and encouragement. But he could feel the weight of expectation settling in the room. Frustration, not impatience. Just the heavy realization that the league was struggling to define him. When the calls finally began, they came with mixed messages. One team expressed strong interest, but asked if he would be willing to transition fully to cornerback. Each conversation felt like a negotiation, not about money or opportunity, but about identity. He was willing to play anywhere. He always had been. But hearing franchises struggle to place him felt like reliving the uncertainty from college, only magnified on the biggest stage of his life. As the draft continued, analysts began discussing him on air. When the time finally came, his phone rang. It was a team that had shown interest earlier in the week. The voice on the other end delivered the news he had been waiting for. They were selecting him. They believed in his potential. They valued his versatility. They wanted him to join their organization. The room erupted in celebration. His family embraced him. A lifetime of work had led to this moment, but even in the excitement, there was a question he hesitated to ask. He had dreamed of reaching the NFL since he was a child. Instead, he was entering the league with the same flexible identity that had defined him for years. It felt like walking through a doorway without knowing what waited on the other side. He was grateful, but he was also aware of the path ahead. Players who enter the league with defined roles have a structure to lean on. They know what to study, how to train, and where to focus their mental and physical energy. He would be asked to prepare for multiple roles at once. He would be competing against specialists who had spent years mastering one position while he balanced several. It was a challenge he had faced before, but the stakes were higher now. The league moves fast. It rewards certainty and exploits hesitation. The days that followed were filled with media questions that echoed the same theme. Reporters asked how he felt about being used in various capacities. They asked whether he preferred offense or defense. They asked whether he believed versatility was his greatest strength. He answered honestly. He said he was ready for anything. He said he just wanted to contribute. Those statements were true, but behind them was a more complicated truth. He wondered whether the league would ever let him fully settle into one identity, or whether he would spend his career shifting from one role to another, always valuable but never rooted. Draft day had given him the destination he wanted. It also revealed the journey ahead, a path defined by possibility but clouded by uncertainty. A path that required him to adapt quickly, work relentlessly, and prove that the player who could do everything could also become someone who belonged somewhere specific. It was both an opportunity and a warning. And though he walked forward with confidence, he carried the quiet understanding that the league would test every part of who he was and who he had been asked to become. Rookie year is supposed to be a baptism of fire that confirms a player's place in the league. It is the moment when preparation meets reality, when talent is tested against speed, strength, and intelligence at the highest level. For most players, that first season provides a structure. There is a position, a depth chart, and a hierarchy to navigate. But he entered the league with no true identity. The team had drafted him for versatility, for the ability to fill gaps, for the rare talent to adapt. They valued him, but they did not define him. From the first day of training camp, he was asked to be everywhere and everything the coaches needed. And it became immediately clear that he would have to learn more, move faster, and endure harder than anyone else. The first practice was chaotic, in a way that only the NFL can produce. Rookies arrive with dreams, veterans arrive with expectations, and coaches arrive with agendas. He was lined up at cornerback for one drill, moved to safety for the next, and then placed on offense for a red zone simulation. By mid-morning, he had learned and executed plays for 3 different units. The veterans were polite but distant, aware that he was an anomaly in a system built on consistency. They recognized his athleticism, but they did not yet understand the toll that being a utility player could extract from a young body and mind. He handled the pace with the quiet confidence that had defined him for years. But under the surface, the seeds of strain were already planted. The coaching staff never intended to ignore him. They were using him exactly as he had been recruited, as a solution to immediate problems. The team had injuries, depth chart holes, and weaknesses in special teams. He was the answer to each of those challenges. There was a short-term plan, but no long-term vision for him at a single position. Every time he executed a new assignment flawlessly, the staff moved the bar higher. The more he could do, the more the team relied on him. And yet, no one ever sat down to define what he was supposed to become. In the NFL, excellence is rewarded when it is measurable and repeatable. In his case, it was both and neither. His contributions were praised, but they were scattered across offense, defense, and special teams. They were valuable, yet intangible, in a system that rewards mastery over breadth. The first game of the season illustrated both his promise and the challenge he faced. He entered as a substitute in a defensive package, making a tackle that demonstrated instinctive understanding. 2 series later, a receiver went down with a hamstring injury, and he was called to fill the slot. He caught a critical third down pass to extend a drive. Later in the game, he was asked to play on punt coverage, racing downfield to push back a dangerous returner. Fans may have noticed a player who seemed everywhere at once, and commentators labeled him as a Swiss Army knife. But internally, he felt the weight of being pulled in 3 directions simultaneously. Every snap demanded full attention. Every assignment a different set of instincts. Every impact on his body a unique collision. He left the field exhausted in ways that went beyond muscles and joints. Rookie nights are supposed to thrill. This one left him quietly anxious. The week after that first game was worse. Rookie meetings, film study, and practice schedules demanded more than any college program had ever asked. And now, instead of focusing on a single position, he had to track multiple playbooks, learn personnel tendencies for both offense and defense, and memorize special team schemes. Sleep became inconsistent. His body ached in new ways. Shoulder bruises, thigh contusions, and back soreness accumulated, each one minor in isolation, but significant in aggregate. He learned to push through because he always had. But the league does not wait for a body to recover. It demands performance, week after week. And in his case, the demand came from multiple directions, none of them negotiable. By mid-season, his adaptability had earned him praise from coaches, media, and even some teammates. He is the kind of player you can throw anywhere and trust he'll get it done, one veteran told reporters. But the praise masked the danger. The more he was used across units, the less anyone considered whether he could develop mastery. In meetings, he asked questions about his long-term role. He was given vague answers. In workouts, he showed flashes of brilliance in multiple areas. Coaches nodded in approval, then assigned him to yet another drill. He began to understand that the versatility that had carried him this far was also isolating him. He was a jack of all trades in a world that valued kings of one craft. The first real fracture came in his body. It was subtle at first. A twinge in the hamstring during route practice, a bruise across the shoulder after a defensive drill, an ache in the knee from a collision on special teams. Individually, these injuries were minor, nothing that would bench a more focused player at a single position. But for him, the accumulation was different. Each injury interacted with the others, each adjustment stressing a body already stretched to meet multiple demands. He learned to compartmentalize pain, to push through, to smile, and say he was fine. That is what players do. That is what the system expects. But he began to feel the physical cost of being everywhere and doing everything. Emotional strain accompanied the physical toll. Every assignment required different decision-making patterns, different reads, different responsibilities. Mistakes could not be forgiven in one role just because he excelled in another. Coaches demanded consistency, but consistency was impossible across multiple units. He began doubting himself quietly, wondering if he could truly succeed long-term, or if he was simply holding the team together until a more specialized player could replace him. He could not talk about it because his willingness to absorb every role had become part of the identity everyone celebrated. The end of his rookie year offered some perspective. Statistically, he contributed across offense, defense, and special teams. He made tackles, caught passes, and played key roles in coverage. Analysts described him as an unusual asset, one of the most versatile rookies in recent memory. Teammates admired his toughness and work ethic. Coaches nodded in agreement, always ready to remind themselves how lucky the team was to have him. But he felt an undercurrent of tension. He had survived the first season physically intact, but the strain was building. His mind had developed resilience, but it carried the early weight of chronic uncertainty, and his identity remained undefined. Entering the second year, he faced the question that would define the next decade of his career. Could he continue to adapt indefinitely without a clearly defined role? Would his body and mind survive the constant shifts? Would he eventually become a player without a position? Valuable yet unclaimed, admired yet unmoored. The league rarely allows for players to be all things and stay whole. Versatility is celebrated until the body and mind pay the price. And he was just beginning to learn how heavy that price could be. Rookie year had given him a foothold, but it had also set the trajectory. He was valued for what he could do, not who he could become. And that duality would shape every step of his professional life. The fractures he felt in body and mind during that first season were small, nearly invisible, yet permanent in nature. They would expand under pressure, defining the very essence of the man who could play everything and ultimately pay the ultimate cost. It was only the beginning of a journey that would ask him to risk everything to be everywhere. The NFL has a way of taking moments of necessity and turning them into permanent expectations. That truth became apparent during his second season, a year that should have been about settling into a role, mastering a position, and building consistency. Instead, it became a demonstration of how quickly a player's willingness to adapt can be exploited. Every injury, every roster gap, every sudden need became an opportunity for him to prove himself. And every time he did, it reinforced the narrative that he could and should do more. What had begun as emergency substitutions gradually became the baseline for what coaches expected from him. The first game that season exemplified the pattern. A starting safety went down in the first quarter. Without hesitation, he stepped into the slot, aligning in the backfield and reading the quarterback with the same instinct he had shown during his rookie season. He made a tackle that prevented a sure touchdown, and the crowd cheered without fully realizing the significance. He had saved the play, but in doing so, he had marked himself as the player who could always save the play. 2 series later, a wide receiver sprained an ankle, and he was immediately inserted into the offensive formation. He caught a crucial third down pass, moved the chains, and kept the drive alive. Later, on punt coverage, he sprinted downfield to push back a dangerous returner, making a tackle that shifted momentum. These moments were celebrated publicly, but privately, they began to accumulate in ways that were less obvious. His teammates expressed admiration, but some also began to joke quietly about how he was always the one expected to plug every hole. Coaches praised his toughness, his intelligence, and his athleticism. They called him a Swiss Army knife, a team player, and a go-to guy. But the labels masked a truth he felt quietly. Being indispensable in multiple roles meant that no one was invested in protecting him. His body and mind were being stretched beyond the parameters that any one position would demand. And no one in the hierarchy recognized that the very trait they relied upon could also become a liability. By mid-season, this pattern was not an exception. It was a standard expectation. A teammate went down on offense, and he was there. Another was injured on defense, and he was there. Special teams always needed a reliable presence, and he was there too. There were no questions, no hesitation, no room for compromise. Coaches no longer viewed him as a rookie who needed guidance. They viewed him as a utility tool, a player whose purpose was to absorb the team's deficiencies. He had entered the league with no true identity, And now his adaptability was being transformed into a system-wide assumption. This was also the moment he began noticing the subtle costs. His body ached in ways he could not explain to anyone without sounding weak. A muscle strain here, a contusion there, minor injuries compounding each week into a chronic tension he could neither name nor escape. Mentally, he began to feel the invisible weight of being the default solution. Each substitution demanded not just physical skill, but mental dexterity. Each role required instinctive understanding of formations, tendencies, and responsibilities. When he made mistakes in one position, it was noted publicly, and he had to compensate in another. There was no margin for error, no pause for reflection, no room to recover. The demands became relentless, and the pattern of expectation was already baked into the team's culture. There were fleeting moments of relief. A coach would praise him publicly, highlight his performance in a game, or note his contribution to the team's success. But those moments were also double-edged. Praise solidified the expectation that he could continue to deliver in multiple roles. This recognition that should have been empowering instead reinforced the structure of exploitation. It became clear that the very act of being willing to fill every gap, to answer every call, was what had tethered him to a system that would use him without giving him a clear path to mastery. By the end of the season, the pattern had cemented. He had played multiple positions in nearly every game. Injuries that might have sidelined another player were absorbed by him, often without complaint. Coaches lauded his versatility and toughness. Fans marveled at his seemingly limitless athleticism, and yet he had little sense of ownership over any single identity on the field. Emergency substitutions were no longer emergencies. They were assumptions. The man who had once been celebrated for his adaptability was now quietly being pushed to a breaking point that neither he nor the team fully recognized. He began to ask himself questions he had never considered in his early years. Was adaptability truly a strength if it came at the cost of mastery? Was being the player who could fill any role sustainable, or was he merely a temporary fix for a team unwilling to invest in stability? Every time he stepped onto the field, he knew he would be asked to do more than any one human could reasonably endure. And every time he did it successfully, the expectation would rise even higher. The line between opportunity and exploitation had blurred, and he was already trapped in a system that rewarded his willingness to be everywhere while failing to define where he truly belonged. Emergency substitutions had become expectations, and expectations had become the invisible chains that would guide the trajectory of his career. Every injury he covered, every gap he filled, every moment of praise carried a hidden cost that he could not yet quantify. He was admired, respected, and celebrated, but also quietly stretched beyond the limits of endurance. And it was only the beginning of a pattern that would follow him throughout his life in the league, shaping every decision, every play, and ultimately, the cost of being the man who could do everything. In the NFL, praise can be both a blessing and a trap. Coaches will laud players who step up, make plays, and absorb pressure, but sometimes that admiration comes with invisible costs. For him, the early years in the league revealed a hard truth. The people who celebrated his versatility often saw him more as a solution than as a human being with limits. They loved him for what he could do immediately, for his ability to fill every gap, to respond to every crisis, to absorb every injury, and to perform flawlessly in multiple roles. But that love had no foundation. It offered no protection, no clear career path, and no long-term stability. What it gave him was utility at the cost of identity. From the first day of training camp, the pattern was apparent. Coaches pointed to him as a model of commitment, intelligence, and toughness. Analysts would later describe him as a rare player, a Swiss Army knife of football who could do anything on the field. On the surface, this praise was deserved. He studied multiple playbooks, learned complex schemes for offense, defense, and special teams, and executed assignments with a precision that often left veterans in awe. He was celebrated publicly, lauded in locker rooms, and admired by the press. But underneath the spotlight, a more complicated reality was emerging. Every accolade reinforced a system that relied on him without investing in him. When a starter went down, he was immediately inserted into the lineup. When an injury struck another unit, he was the first call. Every time he delivered, coaches praised his effort and lauded his professionalism. They called him unselfish, courageous, indispensable. But the praise masked an unspoken expectation that he would continue to shoulder the team's burdens indefinitely. Being celebrated for versatility meant that no one felt the need to protect him or give him a defined role. The admiration became a form of exploitation, subtle but pervasive. He noticed it in small ways at first. Meetings began with his versatility as the primary talking point. Coaches would highlight his adaptability and work ethic, but rarely discuss a plan for where he might settle long-term. Film sessions often pointed out errors, but only in the context of one unit or another. Never in the broader sense of player development. Even when he asked direct questions about his position, the answers were vague. "We'll see where you fit, or we'll figure it out in training camp," they said. That phrase, repeated over and over, became a refrain that signaled both opportunity and peril. He was valued for being everywhere, but that same value prevented him from being anywhere in particular. The physical consequences of this unstructured reliance were subtle but accumulating. Playing multiple positions required constant adjustments, different footwork, hand placement, angles, and responsibilities. One practice could demand skills from offense in the morning, defense in the afternoon, and special teams in the evening. Each adjustment stressed muscles and joints differently, leaving the body in a state of near-constant adaptation. Minor injuries and aches, easily managed by single-position players, began to compound. He learned to push through pain, to ignore fatigue, to compartmentalize discomfort. The subtlety of the exploitation lay in the way praise and pressure were intertwined. He became the player everyone relied upon, the one whose flexibility was celebrated as a virtue. The more he excelled, the more expectations piled on. Every accolade became another weight to bear. The love he received was contingent on output, not growth, and it created a cycle in which his physical and emotional limits were gradually tested without acknowledgement. The dynamic played out most clearly during a critical stretch of his second season. A series of injuries left him starting in unfamiliar positions on consecutive weeks. Each performance was praised publicly, the media highlighting his toughness, the coaching staff calling him irreplaceable, and teammates offering admiration. Behind the scenes, no one discussed a plan for his recovery or a long-term role. The system relied on his resilience, but offered no structure to preserve it. He became indispensable, yet unmoored, a player whose identity was defined by what he could do for others, rather than who he could be. Veteran players noticed the pattern. In private, one offered a quiet warning. They love you for what you give them now, not for what you can become. That kind of love will chew you up if you let it. At the time, he nodded politely, unsure how to act on the advice. He wanted to believe in the praise, to embrace the admiration, and to continue proving himself. It can make you essential, but it can also make you expendable in the long term because no one is invested in your singular growth. By the end of that season, the pattern had become fully entrenched. He was celebrated for doing everything, yet that celebration carried a cost. No protection from overuse, no long-term developmental plan, and no stability in role or identity. Coaches loved him for his willingness to absorb whatever responsibility was necessary. But they did not love him for the man who needed to thrive at a singular position. The praise was conditional, ephemeral, and ultimately a mechanism to extract maximum performance without considering personal sustainability. He had become a cautionary tale in the making, a player celebrated publicly, admired privately, and relied upon institutionally. But without the safeguards, mentorship, or definition necessary to survive the cumulative toll. The cost of being loved for the wrong reasons was beginning to manifest, both in subtle aches and in quiet, unspoken doubts. And the lessons he was learning about expectation, exploitation, and conditional admiration would shape the rest of his career, forcing him to question whether versatility was truly a gift or the first step toward eventual collapse. Pain is a constant companion in the NFL, but for most players, it is concentrated, localized, and at least predictable. A running back may wear down knees and shoulders. A cornerback absorbs hip and ankle stress. A wide receiver battles hamstrings and hands. He, however, had no single position. His body endured punishment from every angle, every week, in every game. One series, he ran routes against the fastest defensive backs in the league. The next, he lined up in the secondary to cover elite receivers. Later, he was on special teams, sprinting, diving, and colliding repeatedly with larger opponents. Each snap demanded different skills, instincts, and physical responses. Each snap left new micro-injuries, cumulative bruises, and subtle strains that few outside the team ever noticed. Early in his career, he accepted the pain as part of the game. He had grown up competing through minor injuries in high school and college. He had played multiple sports, each demanding different muscles, skills, and endurance. A cutback to avoid a defensive lineman at top speed stresses joints that are already fatigued from prior plays. For a player without a defined role, these moments multiplied. Hamstrings ached constantly, shoulders felt chronically inflamed, knees were sore from landing awkwardly on every tackle. Even minor bruises became significant because of the relentless shifting between positions. The cumulative effect was unpredictable pain because the stressors were uneven across his body. Every position demanded a unique punishment. Defensive back requires rapid directional changes. Wide receiver requires explosive acceleration. Special teams demand collisions and sprinting over longer distances. Individually, each would be survivable, but together, they created a constant, multi-point strain that left him walking into every practice and every game with his body already in deficit. By the end of the game, he was physically battered in multiple areas, bruises across the shoulders, a strained hamstring, tenderness in the lower back. Praise came, but it was accompanied by a silent expectation to continue unbroken. The coaches' and teammates' admiration had no built-in protection for his body. The injuries began to influence how he practiced. He adjusted movements to compensate for pain in one area, only to create stress elsewhere. A tweak in the hamstring affected his sprinting mechanics, which then put additional strain on his knees. A shoulder bruise altered his tackling technique, adding torque to the lower back. It was a domino effect that few outside the team could see. He learned to manage the pain strategically, ice stretching and careful movement between drills. But strategy could not undo the fact that every role he played exacted a unique toll on an already taxed body. Fans and media continued to celebrate him for what they could see. A tackle, a reception, a block, a special teams plate, all looked effortless. Analysts described him as fearless, tireless, and indispensable. But these glimpses of performance concealed the ongoing damage accumulating beneath the surface. Being everywhere meant that the concept of a rested player no longer applied. Recovery was fragmented, delayed, or inadequate. Unlike a single-position player, he could not focus rehabilitation on one set of muscles or joints. His injuries were spread unevenly across the body, and every game threatened to worsen them. Every snap, every drill, every game exacerbated the fractures, both literal and figurative, that were forming. Pain was no longer an anomaly. It was the framework of his career. What made the situation particularly perilous was the compounding nature of multi-role physical stress. Unlike players who specialize, his body could never fully recover from one type of impact before being subjected to another. An injury that might have been minor in isolation became significant because it interacted with stressors from other roles. The hamstring that tightened after sprinting routes was stressed further during defensive back coverage. The shoulder bruised on special teams affected tackling mechanics. The lower back fatigued from repeated collisions created a ripple across every movement. He was building strength and skill in one context while eroding resilience in another. The fans continued to cheer. Coaches continued to praise. Analysts continued to marvel at his versatility. And he continued to play through pain, redefining endurance in ways that few outside the locker room could understand. But the cost was mounting. By embracing the very adaptability that had brought him into the league and sustained his early career, he was accelerating the physical toll. Every snap, every assignment, every shift between roles became another layer of wear and tear, pushing him closer to the breaking point that he would later recognize as the price of being the man who could do everything. Being everywhere is a gift in football, but it is also a kind of exile. While others find comfort, identity, and camaraderie within a defined position, he was spread across offense, defense, and special teams. Each unit required allegiance. Each drill demanded focus. Each formation imposed rules and culture. He could master each in isolation, but mastery never equaled belonging. His versatility made him indispensable. Yet it also kept him at the periphery of every group. Never fully accepted, never fully understood. He existed everywhere and nowhere, all at once. In the locker room, the dynamic was subtle but constant. Wide receivers joked about his presence with the polite acknowledgement that he helped them cover gaps. Defensive backs admired his football intelligence, but noted quietly that he was always moving, never fully invested in their rhythm. Special teams players relied on him, yet treated him as a transient figure. He was respected, but not claimed. The language of belonging in football is nuanced. It is about shared assignments, repeated drills, repeated wins, repeated losses, and the sense that your role is understood and protected. In his case, no position fully understood him, and therefore, no position fully protected him. The mental strain of this ambiguity was persistent. He began to question his identity. Was he a defensive back who occasionally lined up on offense? A receiver who could play special teams? Or simply the person who filled every gap in the roster? Unlike other players, whose identities were reinforced by repetition and recognition, his was fractured, reshaped constantly by the team's needs. Every week brought new responsibilities, new adjustments, and new reminders that he did not belong to any one group. Even when he performed flawlessly, the acknowledgement was fleeting, replaced immediately by the next urgent task. Isolation became a quiet companion. Teammates, even those who admired him, never fully included him in their rituals, in their inside jokes, in the subtle bonds that define a unit. Practices and games were collaborative, yet he was always crossing boundaries, shifting from offense to defense, from special teams to individual drills. He could read and anticipate their tendencies, but the sense of being part of a cohesive whole was elusive. He was valued, yet marginal. His contributions were tangible, measurable, and crucial, but his place in the emotional and cultural fabric of the team remained undefined. This ambiguity began to erode confidence in subtle ways. In the locker room, he would hear praise for a tackle or a reception. Yet during critical moments, he would question whether his instincts were trusted, whether he had the right to assert himself, or whether his presence was only tolerated because the team had no alternative. Mentally, he became hypervigilant, constantly aware of scrutiny, constantly calculating risk, constantly adjusting for an audience that never fully acknowledged him as one of their own. The constant negotiation of identity demanded more mental energy than any physical drill. Film study became a battleground for his mind. Unlike players who focus on the tendencies of a single role, he had to analyze multiple units, each with distinct responsibilities, opponents, and schemes. Mistakes were magnified. It's not only because they impacted outcomes, but because they reinforced the sense that he was an outsider in every space he entered. Coaches praised him publicly, but privately. The commentary often carried a subtle expectation that he could continue absorbing mistakes across multiple roles without complaint. The mental load of being everywhere meant that cognitive fatigue accumulated rapidly, sometimes more pronounced than physical exhaustion. The first clear mental crack appeared during a mid-season stretch when the team faced multiple injuries. He was inserted into defensive sets, running back formations, and special teams coverage consecutively over 3 games. Each play demanded rapid decision-making. Each adjustment required deep knowledge of multiple playbooks, and each collision added to physical strain. Mentally, the repetition and constant shifting created an undercurrent of anxiety. He began to question whether he could maintain the pace, whether mistakes would compound, whether the team could truly rely on him without eroding his own sense of self. He was being counted on to deliver everywhere, yet no space on the field fully claimed him as one of their own. This absence of belonging extended off the field. Team dinners, road trips, and locker room conversations often reinforced group identity. He participated, yet the sense of permanence eluded him. He was there to fill gaps, to adapt, to absorb needs, but no role in the team's culture fully anchored him. The lack of belonging manifested in subtle isolation. Teammates would seek each other for guidance in their position group, but rarely him. His body bore the bruises, the sprains, and the soreness, but his mind carried a heavier weight, the persistent tension of never fully belonging. Versatility, once celebrated as his greatest strength, had become a source of emotional instability. He was indispensable to the team's functioning. Yet he existed in a liminal space where no single group fully embraced him. Teams need players who can fill gaps, but the culture of the NFL rewards identity, cohesion, and mastery within a defined role. He had all the tools, all the skill, all the intelligence, but the structure of the league and the expectations of coaches meant that his contributions never fully translated into inclusion. Being everywhere had become a subtle form of exile. Could a player survive decades of this constant negotiation of self? This perpetual balancing act between necessity and identity? Could the mind endure the repeated affirmation that he was valued, yet the repeated reminder that he had no true home? These questions grew quietly, subtly, and without easy answers. The mental burden of never belonging anywhere became as consequential as the physical toll he was accumulating. Every play, every drill, every game reinforced the dual reality. He was indispensable, yet unclaimed, celebrated, yet isolated, present, yet untethered. By the end of the chapter, the lesson was unmistakable. Talent, versatility, and intelligence could not compensate for the absence of stability, identity, and belonging. Being everywhere exacted a cost invisible to fans and even to teammates. A persistent mental strain, a quiet anxiety, and a growing sense that no matter how much he contributed, no role would ever fully accept him. Film is where the truth of football lives. On the surface, it looks like repetition, like study, like preparation. But for the NFL player, it is also where the cracks in identity, strategy, and expectation are exposed. For him, the film room became a place of isolation. Unlike his teammates, who could focus on a single position, one playbook, one unit, he was forced to master multiple playbooks simultaneously. Offense, defense, and special teams were all on his shoulders, each with its own rules, tendencies, and nuances. The more he absorbed, the more his mental energy drained. What had once been a source of pride versatility was now a source of strain, pressure, and burnout. During his second and third seasons, he began spending hours alone after team meetings, reviewing every position in detail. Wide receiver routes, defensive coverages, blocking schemes, and special teams responsibilities all demanded attention. A single misread could lead to a turnover, a missed tackle, or a critical breakdown on special teams. He quickly realized that mistakes were amplified because he was spread thin across units. Whereas a player who focused on one role could afford to internalize tendencies and refine execution. He had to constantly shift mental gears, sometimes within the same game. The cognitive load was relentless, leaving him perpetually one step behind in memory, instinct, or instinctive reaction. The isolation was both physical and psychological. In the film room, other players huddled around position coaches, asking questions, reviewing tendencies, and bonding over shared responsibilities. He often sat alone, not because he was unwelcome, but because no single coach could advocate for him in a meaningful way. Offensive coaches did not have time to guide him through defensive responsibilities. Defensive coaches could not focus on his special teams assignments. He existed in a liminal space between departments, appreciated for effort, but lacking ownership. Every question he had was met with fragmented answers, every correction with partial guidance. He was supported in theory, but alone in execution. Burnout became inevitable. Nights spent reviewing film stretched into hours past curfew. And the repetitive mental gymnastics created stress headaches, disrupted sleep, and anxiety that he could not shake. Physical fatigue compounded the strain. After practices, he would review snaps from multiple positions while nursing aches in knees, shoulders, hamstrings, and back. His body carried the visible marks of overuse. His mind carried the invisible ones. Mistakes on film began to multiply, not because he lacked skill, but because the system demanded expertise in too many areas simultaneously. Each misread carried consequences: coaches' scrutiny, media notice, and self-reproach. Mistakes, no matter how minor, were magnified by expectation. He had become the default fix for every hole in the roster. Every lapse in execution was seen not just as an error, but as a failure to fulfill a broad spectrum of roles. A poorly timed block on offense would be noted alongside a missed coverage on defense and a punt return misstep. The cumulative critique was relentless. Mental fatigue eroded instinctual responses. What had once been reflex became calculation, and calculation slowed his performance, leaving him exposed to criticism despite the extraordinary range of responsibilities he managed. Compounding the challenge was the lack of mentorship. Other players had advocates, position coaches, coordinators, veterans who could shepherd them, provide insight, and adjust expectations based on growth or struggle. He had fragments of support in every area, but no consistent advocate. Offensive coaches would praise his effort on routes, but leave defensive errors unaddressed. Defensive coaches would note his coverage strengths, but ignore special teams' shortcomings. Special teams coaches celebrated his tenacity, but did not account for the mental fatigue of his other responsibilities. He was admired, but unsupported, left to navigate a complex landscape of knowledge, expectation, and responsibility alone. The isolation in the film room began to shape his approach to football. He became hyperanalytical, overthinking scenarios to compensate for gaps in preparation that were unavoidable. Every play demanded mental rehearsal, every formation required cognitive cross-training, and every practice forced a balance between roles. Where others relied on instinct honed by repetition, he relied on calculation refined by necessity. It was effective in small doses, but unsustainable over time. The mental strain became cumulative, producing moments of hesitation on the field that contradicted his natural athleticism. Even the support structures that existed within the team felt insufficient. Film assistants provided clips, coordinators handed down schemes, and veteran players offered advice, but none of it coalesced into a consistent system for his unique challenge. The lesson of this period is clear. A player who must master multiple playbooks will inevitably face cognitive and emotional strain beyond that of his peers. The demands of knowledge, anticipation, and rapid execution in several roles simultaneously create a unique vulnerability. Mistakes are inevitable, burnout becomes predictable, and the mental load erodes both confidence and instinct. He was learning this lesson firsthand. To be indispensable is to be alone, and to be versatile is to be under constant mental siege. By the season's end, the isolation in the film room had left an indelible mark. It was a space of learning, yes, but also a space of relentless pressure. No single coach advocated fully for him. No unit claimed him completely, and no role offered reprieve. The mental toll was cumulative, and the stress he carried in private foreshadowed the challenges that would define the remainder of his career. The man who could play everywhere was, paradoxically, trapped nowhere. The foundation of burnout, mental strain, and mistakes had been laid in quiet. Invisible sessions in a room meant to teach, not to isolate. There is a strange kind of immortality in football when a player transcends position, becomes indispensable in every facet of the game, and etches their name into record books in ways no one imagined. For him, that year was legendary, at least on paper. It was a season in which he truly did it all, filling in wherever the team needed him. Running back, wide receiver, linebacker, defensive back, special teams, even occasional snaps at wildcat quarterback. His name appeared across the stat sheet in categories no one player had ever populated before. To fans and analysts, it was an extraordinary display of talent and courage. To him, it was a year of survival, a test of endurance, and the first signs of a collapse that would be irreversible. The season began quietly, with injuries already shaping the team's depth chart. The starting running back went down in the preseason. The wide receiver corps was thin, and linebackers were repeatedly sidelined by contact injuries. Coaches turned to him not as a plan, but as a patchwork solution. At first, it felt empowering. For someone who had always prided himself on adaptability, the opportunity to contribute everywhere validated years of effort, sacrifice, and preparation. He studied film obsessively, rehearsed multiple skill sets, and mentally prepared for the uncertainty that each snap could bring. Week 1 of the season became the first glimpse of what was to come. He lined up in the backfield on one drive, taking a handoff, shifting the defensive alignment and absorbing hits while executing routes. By the next drive, he was in the secondary, reading the quarterback, tracking the receiver, and delivering tackles with precision. Special teams demanded another set of skills, entirely sprinting downfield, executing blocks, and covering kickoffs with calculated aggression. Every snap demanded a unique physical and mental adjustment, yet he moved through them seamlessly, a testament to conditioning, intelligence, and resilience. Statisticians and historians would later describe the season as unprecedented. Few players in NFL history had contributed meaningfully across so many categories in a single year. He was recording receptions, rushing yards, tackles, pass breakups, and special teams contributions in a way that defied comparison. Media coverage marveled at the breadth of his skill, calling him a football anomaly and a one-man Swiss Army knife. Fans adored him for the spectacle of his versatility. Yet the underlying reality was far more fragile. While he delivered heroics on the field, every game added incremental damage to his body, layered stress to his mind, and further obscured a singular identity. The physical toll was immediate and intense. Each position imposed different forces on his body. Running back carries compressive stress on the knees and hips. Linebacker absorbs repeated collisions that strain the shoulders, back, and lower extremities. Defensive back requires rapid lateral movement and reaction that loads joints in unfamiliar ways. Special teams imposes sprinting and tackling impacts without the rhythm of standard plays. To navigate all of these roles in a single season was unprecedented and unsustainable. Minor aches and strains, which might have been manageable for a single-position player, became chronic problems in overlapping systems. By mid-season, he felt the cumulative effect in ways that no box score or highlight reel could convey. Mentally, the season was a labyrinth. Every snap required rapid recall of multiple playbooks. Pre-snap adjustments differed by formation, personnel, and opponent. Cognitive fatigue set in within minutes of the first series and intensified throughout each game. Mistakes were magnified because errors in one role often had consequences in another. A blown assignment on defense could set up a scoring opportunity that altered offensive priorities. And a missed block on special teams could compromise the field position for the offense. He learned to compartmentalize, to isolate each play mentally. But the strain of constantly switching contexts accelerated exhaustion and eroded instinctual confidence. Coaches lauded him publicly, praising his courage, intelligence, and work ethic. Analysts described him as fearless, tireless, and indispensable. The accolades were genuine in tone, but the subtext was unmistakable. The team would continue to rely on him in every capacity because no one else could fill the gaps. The love and recognition from authority figures came intertwined with relentless expectation. He was indispensable, yes, but also expendable, in the sense that his utility allowed the team to avoid investing in proper depth or player development elsewhere. Every snap reinforced that paradox. Even as he reached peak versatility, cracks were appearing. Minor injuries compounded. Muscle fatigue and joint stress slowed reactions. Mental lapses appeared in moments of high pressure. On a critical fourth-quarter play in a mid-season game, he misread a coverage assignment, allowing a touchdown. It was the first high-profile mistake of the season, and the frustration was not just from the error itself, but from the awareness that the system demanded. Near perfection across multiple roles. One lapse in a singular position could be managed, but one lapse across multiple positions had magnified consequences. He carried not only the physical aftermath, but also the psychological burden of accountability that no other player experienced. Despite the growing physical and mental strain, he continued to excel statistically. Rushing yards piled up, receptions increased, tackles were recorded, and special teams impact remained high. Fans marveled at his endurance. Sports writers called it a career-defining year. Yet behind every highlight was an invisible ledger of accumulated punishment micro-tears, bruises, joint inflammation, and cognitive fatigue. Each yard gained, each tackle made, each play executed flawlessly was a small victory against a system that extracted everything without pause. This season marked a pivotal moment in his career. The paradox of ultimate utility and ultimate vulnerability. He became a statistical anomaly, admired for versatility, feared by opponents for unpredictability, and celebrated in media narratives as the quintessential team player. But he also began a process of irreversible decline. The physical strain accelerated wear on his body in ways that could not be undone. The mental strain compounded stress and anxiety, and the constant shifting between roles prevented the formation of a secure professional identity. The peak of versatility became the first clear indicator of future collapse. By the season's end, he had played in every conceivable role, had contributed meaningfully to every unit, and had set records that would be cited for decades. Yet the cost was incalculable. His body carried injuries in multiple systems. His mind carried stress, self-doubt, and exhaustion. He had proven his worth as the player who could do anything, but he had also begun to pay the price that comes with being indispensable without protection. Celebrated without support, and lauded without a plan. The year he played every position was simultaneously the apex and the beginning of the unraveling that would define the next chapters of his life and career. The very skill that made him invaluable on the field became a liability at the bargaining table. For years, he had been the solution to every roster gap, the player coaches relied on to absorb injuries, fill vacancies, and deliver in any role. Yet when it came time to translate that versatility into financial security, he discovered an uncomfortable truth. Being everywhere had made it impossible to quantify his worth. Teams could see his contributions, admire his adaptability, and celebrate his toughness. But when contracts were negotiated, there was no single metric to define him. Unlike a running back with yardage, a quarterback with touchdowns, or a defensive end with sacks, his statistics were spread across categories. His value was cumulative, diffuse, and inconveniently unmeasurable. The first negotiation came after his peak season, the one in which he had played every position, contributed to every unit, and created statistical anomalies no analyst could have predicted. He walked into the meeting hoping that the performance, the highlight reel plays, the countless hours of sacrifice, and the unseen bruises he carried would be recognized in the form of a substantial contract. He expected the acknowledgement of years spent giving everything to the team. But the language of the front office was different. In their eyes, his versatility was both a marvel and a complicating factor. How do you value a player who does a little bit of everything, but is not elite at one position? How do you assign a dollar figure to someone whose success cannot fit neatly into a statistical box? Negotiations quickly became frustrating. The team cited his lack of a singular identity as justification for a modest offer. "We love what you do," the general manager said, "but you don't have a clear position. We can T-pay like a starter at one spot because you re-stretched across all of them." The words stung because they ignored the sacrifices he had made, the injuries he had endured, and the cognitive and physical load he carried each game. He was being asked to demonstrate excellence in every dimension of football, yet rewarded financially as if he were a role player. His versatility, celebrated on Sundays, became a rationalization for undervaluation in contract talks. There was also a psychological component to the negotiations. Agents and front office personnel sometimes seemed baffled by his profile. He did not conform to the typical narratives of star players whose worth was easily codified by position, statistics, and accolades. Instead, he embodied a paradox, indispensable yet hard to define. The team appreciated his contributions enough to keep him around, but his utility allowed them to maintain leverage. They could argue that he filled multiple gaps and therefore did not require a top-tier salary for any single one of them. Versatility, once a shield, had become a cage. The experience left him frustrated and disillusioned. On the field, he had been celebrated, praised, and admired. Off the field, in negotiations where his career's longevity and stability were at stake, he was met with rationalized undervaluation. There was no clear acknowledgement of the risk he had absorbed or the injuries he had accumulated. There was no premium for durability, adaptability, or selflessness. The league had long rewarded specialization and statistical excellence in a single position. By contrast, he had become a player whose excellence was diffuse, remarkable but difficult to monetize. The negotiations dragged on. His agent tried to argue for a package that reflected cumulative contributions, citing special teams tackles, offensive yardage, defensive metrics, and intangible value, leadership, toughness, and versatility. The team responded with data that minimized these contributions. They compared him to players at singular positions, emphasizing that none of his individual metrics exceeded the top performers at each role. It was a strategy that, while technically accurate, ignored the reality that no other player endured the same breadth of responsibility. The negotiation felt less like a fair assessment and more like a calculation designed to limit his leverage. Financial undervaluation began to breed resentment and fatigue. He realized that the system which celebrated him for his willingness to do everything also allowed teams to extract value without fully compensating for the cost. Injuries accumulated, mental strain persisted. And now there was a tangible consequence. His career earnings were being suppressed because his work did not fit into conventional categories. It was a bitter irony. The very quality that had sustained him on the field had created a financial ceiling he could not overcome. He had become a cautionary tale in which versatility, while admired publicly, was exploited privately. The psychological impact was significant. He felt both essential and undervalued, admired and overlooked, celebrated and constrained. Each conversation with the front office reinforced the sense that he had been both rewarded and punished by his own adaptability. He had given everything, yet he was asked to justify his contributions in a framework that could not accommodate them. The cognitive and emotional stress of performance had been one challenge. The stress of financial inequity compounded it. The system demanded resilience on the field and compliance at the table. Both came at a cost, yet only one was publicly acknowledged. This tension affected performance as well. While he continued to deliver on the field, a subtle sense of frustration and diminished trust began to creep into his decision-making. He had always thrived on the belief that hard work, adaptability, and courage would be rewarded. The realization that no contractual or structural acknowledgement existed for these qualities introduced a quiet but persistent stressor. He began to calculate not only how to survive on the field, but how to negotiate survival within a system that did not fully value him. The dual pressure, the physical and mental, the immediate and the long-term, began to shape both his approach to the game and his perception of the league itself. By the end of the season, the contract negotiations had delivered a harsh lesson. Versatility in the NFL can be both a blessing and a trap. While it ensures indispensability on the field, it can obscure value off it. Players who exist everywhere are difficult to categorize, difficult to measure, and therefore often undervalued financially. He had learned that recognition in one domain performance did not guarantee recognition in another compensation. The paradox of the man who could do everything was now complete, indispensable, admired, exploited, and constrained simultaneously. The financial undervaluation foreshadowed later challenges as well. Injuries that had accumulated over years, mental strain from constant role switching, and a lack of long-term planning combined with insufficient compensation to create both immediate and systemic vulnerabilities. The league's framework rewarded specialization, yet he had sacrificed singular mastery for versatility. The irony was inescapable. The same quality that had ensured his survival on Sundays limited his security off the field. It was a cautionary moment in a career defined by paradox. A moment that revealed that being indispensable did not guarantee fairness, stability, or protection. To the public, it is a compelling story of talent, determination, and sacrifice. But behind the flash, behind the accolades and the sound bites, there is a human toll that goes largely unexamined. The media narrative is simple. Versatility equals heroism. Sports shows replay his miraculous catches, his last-minute tackles, his ability to anticipate and adapt. Fans cheer. The narrative is clean, cinematic, and digestible. It tells the story of a player who exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary football. Yet in this simplicity, the story leaves out everything else: the strain, the isolation, the injuries, the mental burden. the constant negotiation of identity, and the exploitation hidden behind admiration. He became a media favorite precisely because he fit the archetype of the extraordinary worker, the man who could do it all. Journalists loved the angle, an everyman who thrived under pressure, an athlete who filled in for injured teammates and never complained. Commentators called him versatile, resilient, fearless, and selfless. The story was inspirational, but the man behind it remained invisible. The media told a story of triumph. He lived a story of survival. Every praise carried an implicit expectation that he would continue performing miracles, regardless of cost. Even human interest pieces sanitized the emotional reality. Interviews framed his experience as a story of perseverance, dedication, and team-first mentality. Fans loved the narrative of selflessness, the idea of a player willing to sacrifice comfort and health for the greater good. But the pressure behind the persona, the moments of doubt, the mental exhaustion from juggling multiple responsibilities, and the subtle erosion of identity were absent from the coverage. He would read glowing profiles that celebrated his adaptability while simultaneously navigating the consequences of the very versatility that reporters praised. Injuries piled up, film study demanded endless cognitive effort, and coaches relied on him across units with minimal rest or consideration. One dropped pass, one missed tackle, one misread on special teams became a focal point of criticism. The same media that glorified his every success was swift to highlight any misstep. The coverage lacked nuance. It failed to acknowledge the mental and physical complexity of his role. Despite these pressures, he remained committed to his team, to his responsibilities, and to the game itself. The paradox of the media's attention created a persistent mental weight that added to the physical and cognitive strain he already carried. By the end of the season, the cost of media praise was evident. Fans applauded, reporters marveled. Analysts wrote glowing accounts. But the man behind the story was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The narrative of heroism obscured the realities of his experience. He had achieved statistical marvels, remarkable feats, and career highlights that few players could match. Yet he had also endured isolation, burnout, and relentless pressure without acknowledgement or reprieve. The media loved the story of the player who could do everything, but the human cost, the toll on his body, mind, and identity, remained largely invisible. The lesson of this period is critical. Public recognition can mask personal cost. Media narratives elevate achievement, highlight spectacle, and craft mythology. But they rarely account for the cumulative impact on human life. For a player like him, whose career depended on versatility, the story celebrated his contribution while obscuring the price he paid. He had become a hero in the public imagination, but the reality was one of struggle, endurance, and hidden sacrifice. The admiration of millions could not compensate for the exhaustion, isolation, and relentless demands that defined his daily existence. In retrospect, this phase of his career highlights a recurring paradox. To be versatile is to be essential. To be essential is to be celebrated. Yet celebration does not equal understanding, and admiration does not equal protection. The public could see the extraordinary plays, the multi-positional contributions, and the statistical anomalies. But they could not see the fractures, the fatigue, and the emotional burden. His story was sensationalized, admired, and repeated. But the man behind the feats remained largely invisible to the world that consumed his legend. Football is a game built on the assumption that the body can endure. But there comes a point when endurance is no longer enough, when the cumulative toll of hits, collisions, strains, and overuse converges into a breaking point. For him, that season arrived without warning, yet in retrospect, it was inevitable. Years of filling every role, of answering every call, of absorbing punishment across the entire field, had built a ledger of debt against his body that could not be repaid. It was the season his body gave up, the season the consequences of versatility became visible in stark, frightening clarity. The injuries were not sudden in isolation. They were small at first. A tight hamstring here, a bruised shoulder there, minor tweaks to knees and ankles. Alone, each would have been manageable. But his career had conditioned him to push through, to ignore pain, and to absorb strain in the name of team needs. Running back one play, safety the next, linebacker in the following series. Special teams in another, his body never had the opportunity to fully recover between collisions or positional demands. By midseason, these small injuries compounded into systemic failure. Joints screamed under constant impact. Muscles fatigued beyond repair. Tendons inflamed. Ligaments stretched thin. The cumulative effect was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. The turning point came during a nationally televised game. Early in the second quarter, he lined up at linebacker against a powerful offensive set. He anticipated the play perfectly, read the quarterback's eyes, and surged to meet the ball carrier. The hit was textbook, perfectly executed in theory. Yet the impact reverberated through his lower back, knees, and shoulders simultaneously. For a moment, he collapsed mid-stride, caught between instinct and injury, aware that the pain was unlike anything he had experienced. The crowd roared, but to him, it was a blur of noise, indistinguishable from the pounding in his joints and the sharp edge of trauma coursing through his body. He finished the play, somehow, but the moment marked the beginning of an irreversible freefall. After the game, medical evaluations revealed multiple minor but significant injuries, muscle tears, ligament strains, joint inflammation, and early signs of chronic stress. Individually, none might have ended a career, but in combination, they painted a frightening picture. His body, tasked with performing across so many positions, was failing in ways no single-position player would likely encounter. Every role had left its mark, every snap had contributed to the collapse, and the very versatility that defined him had become the instrument of damage. Emotionally, the realization hit hard. He had always believed that doing more, being everywhere, and sacrificing for the team would protect his career, extend his tenure, and solidify his legacy. Instead, it had left him vulnerable in every sense. The physical breakdown mirrored the mental strain he had carried for years. Isolation in film rooms, pressure from coaches, scrutiny from media, undervaluation in contracts. Every system he had navigated, physical, mental, organizational, now converged into a singular, unavoidable crisis. The man who could play everything had reached the limits of what a human body could endure. The season unfolded as a struggle against inevitability. He attempted to continue playing through the pain, as he always had. Each game was a negotiation between instinct and limitation, courage and caution. Early in the season, he could mask the injuries with adrenaline, focus, and sheer will. By mid-season, however, the masking no longer sufficed. His reaction time slowed, minor errors became glaring mistakes, and fatigue left him exposed to further injury. The more he tried to maintain performance, the faster his body deteriorated. His versatility, once a superpower, had become an unsustainable liability. Teammates and coaches noticed the decline, but their concern was often filtered through the lens of need. They admired his toughness. They praised his willingness to play. Yet they relied on him even more, perhaps subconsciously understanding that if he stepped away, the team would collapse in those areas he filled. The paradox was cruel. The more he was breaking, the more indispensable he became. Each snap demanded not only skill, but negotiation with pain. Each practice required a balance between contribution and preservation. His body was signaling limits he could not acknowledge publicly, because the team, the coaches, and the culture demanded endurance above all else. Media coverage, meanwhile, continued to celebrate his heroics, ignoring the fractures beneath the surface. Fans saw miraculous plays, unbelievable endurance, and statistical feats. They did not see the tight tendons, the swollen joints, the bruised ribs, or the sharp pains that accompanied every tackle and every sprint. They did not see the private moments of reflection in which he wondered whether the pursuit of versatility had been worth the accumulating damage. The public narrative glorified a story of resilience, but the lived reality was one of warning signs, quiet desperation, and mounting physical cost. The season's end brought sobering assessments. Medical staff recommended rest, rehabilitation, and caution. He was advised to limit exposure to high-impact positions and to focus on recovery. But the structure of his career, the expectations of the team, and his own identity as the indispensable player made it difficult to heed that advice fully. Stepping back, even temporarily, felt like betrayal both to the team and to himself. His value had always been tied to his ability to be everywhere, to absorb every role, to deliver in any capacity. To slow down was to risk irrelevance, to risk losing the identity he had spent years building. It was also the moment he understood the fragility of a career built on versatility. Unlike players whose injuries can be isolated and managed, his body had accumulated stress in multiple systems simultaneously. Recovery would be more complex, rehabilitation longer, and the risk of recurring injury higher. His physical narrative, which had once been defined by adaptability, speed, and toughness, was now punctuated by warning signs, persistent aches, recurrent inflammation, and moments in games when instinct alone could not overcome damage. He had reached the limits imposed not by talent, but by the human body itself. This season marked the beginning of the downward trajectory. From that point forward, every game carried the dual risk of performance failure and physical catastrophe. He was no longer merely versatile. He was vulnerable. The accumulation of injuries, compounded by years of role hopping and high expectations, signaled that the career which had once been defined by boundless opportunity was now constrained by the very excellence that had defined it. His body had reached the edge of endurance, and the collapse that had been slowly gestating over multiple seasons was now unavoidable. In reflection, this season is a lesson in the limits of human durability. Versatility, adaptability, and courage can create legends, but they can also accelerate decline. His story demonstrates how the very qualities that elevate a player to rare heights on the field can simultaneously sow the seeds of physical breakdown. Combination of exposure, overuse, and expectation is relentless. The season his body gave up was both a consequence of his extraordinary talent and a warning about the cost of being indispensable without boundaries. By the end of that year, the scoreboard told one story: heroics, statistical anomalies, and remarkable plays. The human body, however, told another: exhaustion, accumulated trauma, and the beginning of an irreversible decline. For him, versatility had become both legacy and liability. What once made him untouchable on the field now made him precarious. The narrative of invincibility could no longer mask the vulnerabilities beneath the surface. The next chapters of his life and career would be shaped by that convergence of brilliance and collapse, a testament to the ultimate cost of being asked to do everything. In football, respect is currency. It is earned through performance, loyalty, toughness, and the unspoken proof that one can carry the weight of expectation. For him, respect had once come effortlessly. Teammates and coaches relied on him for every gap, every hole, every emergency, and he delivered. He was indispensable in a way few players could imagine. Yet, as his body faltered and injuries began to accumulate, that currency of respect started to wane not because of failure, but because the system that had once elevated him had evolved, and new players had arrived to fill singular roles. The paradox was cruel. The same versatility that had earned him adulation now rendered him expendable in the eyes of a locker room that thrives on clarity of identity and specialization. The first signs were subtle. Younger players joined the team, drafted or signed to fill specific positions: running back, linebacker, defensive back, wide receiver. They were highly specialized, drilled in single roles, and physically fresh. Coaches began to lean on them in situations where he had once been the default solution. He was no longer the first call for an emergency substitution. He was asked to step back, to make way, to fill only secondary or tertiary roles rather than being the centerpiece of improvisation. Each assignment carried the implicit reminder: the team can survive without you performing everything. In his mind, it was a small but profound shift, a whisper that his indispensability was eroding. Locker room dynamics began to reflect this transition. Younger players, naturally ambitious and competitive, had no understanding of the years of sacrifice he had endured to maintain his role. They saw versatility, but not the toll it had taken. They saw a player occasionally slowed by injury or fatigue and interpreted it as weakness or decline. The camaraderie that had once been effortless now carried subtle tension, because his contributions were no longer as immediately visible or necessary. He found himself on the periphery of conversations, no longer the first voice in strategy discussions, no longer the default mentor in every scenario. He was a relic of adaptability in a culture increasingly obsessed with specialization. Coaches, too, treated him differently. The admiration that had once translated into trust and opportunity now shifted toward efficiency. In critical moments, they preferred younger, fresher players with singular focus. His input was acknowledged, but the practical reliance had diminished. He found himself on the sideline more often than in the game, watching as others carried out roles he had once embodied in their entirety. The psychological impact was acute. He had spent years defining his identity through adaptability. Yet now his value was being measured by the conventional standards he had once transcended. Being a jack of all trades was no longer enough in a system that rewarded elite mastery in a single dimension. This shift also altered his interactions with teammates. Veteran players who had once respected him for his toughness and versatility now spoke more cautiously. Younger players, seeing him no longer central to the strategy, naturally sought leadership from others. The admiration he had cultivated through sacrifice became difficult to maintain when the team's needs changed. There was no ill intent. The evolution was structural, inevitable, and merciless. He had given everything. Yet the loyalty of the locker room, a reflection of relevance and impact, was slowly moving elsewhere. He was left to reconcile the pride of past achievements with the reality of present redundancy. The loss of standing had practical consequences as well. Playtime decreased, opportunities to demonstrate skill diminished, and his influence in shaping game outcomes weakened. In interviews and public appearances, the narrative remained one of admiration. But inside, the reality was more complicated. Every snap not taken, every assignment not granted, felt like a subtle reminder that his career had reached a plateau he could no longer extend by sheer versatility. He had once been indispensable. Now he was optional. The psychological weight of this transition was heavier than any single hit on the field. Isolation compounded the challenge. As he spent more time on the sideline, watching others perform the roles he had once mastered, he began to question identity and legacy. But was he still the same player who had defined entire games? Or had he become a cautionary figure, a relic of a bygone era where adaptability was prized over specialization? The locker room, once a place of affirmation and mutual reliance, had become a mirror reflecting vulnerability and obsolescence. The intangible respect he had earned through years of sacrifice was fading, replaced by practical assessments of ability in narrow terms. There were moments of bitterness, though fleeting. He recognized the unfairness years of extraordinary contribution rendered almost invisible as new, specialized talent arrived. He had carried the team through injury crises, shoulder to shoulder with every unit, and yet now his efforts were taken for granted, soon to be permanent fixtures rather than extraordinary feats. This sense of being undervalued, different from media neglect, different from contract disputes, cut deeper. It was personal, internal, and constant, because it touched the very foundation of identity he had built through decades of labor. Yet, he remained committed. Despite declining standing, he showed up. Despite the loss of influence, he mentored quietly, advised when asked, and prepared for any opportunity the team might still require. In many ways, his response reflected a career-long pattern. Selflessness intertwined with duty, pride intertwined with sacrifice. But there was also a growing recognition of the gap between perception and reality. He could no longer rely on versatility alone to maintain relevance. The system that had once depended on him had evolved past the need for a man who could do everything. Adaptability had become, paradoxically, a liability. By mid-season, the effect on morale and identity was undeniable. He approached practices with the same intensity as ever, yet the internal calculus had shifted. Each game required negotiation between physical capacity and psychological resilience. The sense of belonging that had once been effortless, rooted in indispensability, was now conditional, fragile, and fleeting. He had spent a career building reputation and respect, and now he faced the reality that legacy could be immediate and measurable, or invisible and enduring, but rarely both. The locker room, once his domain of influence, had subtly realigned. Respect, which had been absolute during his years of peak versatility, had become contingent, measured not by past heroics, but by current capacity to contribute in singular, specialized roles. Players who had arrived later did not carry the history, the context, or the accumulated sacrifices. To them, he was a peer, a veteran, perhaps admirable, but no longer the indispensable linchpin. The slow erosion of standing was painful precisely because it was invisible too. Outsiders yet unmistakably felt in every interaction, every game, every practice. By the end of the season, he understood that the man who could do everything could also be made irrelevant. It was a cruel calculus. Years of self-sacrifice, of enduring physical and mental strain, of thriving in every imaginable role, had built both legend and vulnerability. In a culture that prizes specialization and immediate contribution, versatility had become a liability. The loss of locker room standing was not a sudden event. It was the accumulation of countless small shifts, subtle recalibrations, and inevitable structural decisions by the team. He had sacrificed everything, yet recognition from those closest to him was no longer assured. This chapter in his career underscores a brutal truth about professional sports. Respect is contingent on current utility, not past heroism. Achievements, sacrifices, and versatility may secure admiration from fans and media. But inside the locker room, relevance is defined by immediate impact, positional clarity, and measurable output. He had given the league decades of extraordinary service. Yet standing in the locker room, a vital measure of professional and psychological security was slipping away. In professional football, the line between loyalty and business is razor thin, often invisible until it is crossed. For him, that line was crossed in a way that felt abrupt, cold, and deeply personal. Years of adaptability, heroics, and sacrifice culminated not in recognition or reward, but in a phone call that reduced a career to a sentence. There was no preamble, no negotiation, no time to prepare mentally for the reality of rejection. He had become a man without a defined position, a player without a measurable niche, and in the harsh calculus of roster management, that translated to expendability. The morning started like any other. Meetings, practice, film review. The routine was familiar, almost comforting, even in the midst of lingering injuries and diminishing playtime. Yet the familiarity belied a fragile truth. His versatility, once celebrated, now offered him no protection. The coaching staff had shifted priorities toward younger, specialized talent. The front office, guided by cap concerns and long-term planning, had concluded that the utility he offered was no longer sufficient to justify a roster spot. There were no discussions of gratitude, no acknowledgement of years of silent sacrifice. There was only the cold, practical decision: he no longer fit the roster. The conversation was brief. A manager or executive, someone whose face had been familiar for years, delivered the news with procedural efficiency. There was no argument, no emotional appeal accepted, no leverage to be had. He could point to statistics, versatility, dedication, or past heroics. But the system did not account for those qualities when they could not be quantified into a singular value. No position meant no bargaining power. His breadth of contribution, once his identity and strength, had become the source of vulnerability. The very thing that defined him now rendered him powerless in a business that prizes simplicity, specialization, and projection. The cut reverberated immediately. Locker room dynamics shifted. Teammates offered polite condolences, but there was no way to restore what had been lost. Fans who had celebrated his adaptability were left confused. Media coverage framed it as a business inevitability rather than a personal blow. Yet for him, the experience was devastating because it touched both identity and survival. He had spent years as the man who could do everything, the one who absorbed every need of the team, only to find that when the system no longer required him, there was no safety net. His career, built on versatility, had left him exposed to a final, unceremonious dismissal. The personal impact was immediate and profound. For weeks, he grappled with disbelief. The body that had been pushed to the limit, the mind that had been stretched across positions and playbooks, and the heart that had committed fully to team success now faced a void. There was no next snap, no next assignment, no framework in which to continue proving worth. The absence of a defined role meant there was no avenue for redemption, no opportunity to showcase resilience within a team structure. His professional identity, so long intertwined with action, adaptability, and contribution, was suddenly undefined. Financial consequences compounded the emotional toll. Contract negotiations had already been tenuous because versatility defies conventional valuation, but being cut erased even the limited leverage he had left. There was no guaranteed salary, no extended benefits, no platform from which to negotiate a better outcome. His versatility, which had once been an asset in the abstract, had offered no protection when measured against the concrete imperatives of roster limits, cap management, and strategic planning. It became clear that, in a league that rewards specialization and clear metrics, being everything to everyone could paradoxically leave a man with nothing. The psychological ramifications were equally severe. He had spent a career building self-worth through action, contribution, and adaptability. Being cut abruptly undermined the very foundation of identity that had sustained him through pain, scrutiny, and personal sacrifice. For the first time in years, he was confronted not with the pressures of playing every position, not with the physical consequences of abuse, but with the reality of obsolescence. He was no longer defined by utility, by performance, or by versatility. In the league of endless calculation, he had become unmeasurable and therefore unnecessary. Friends and family became critical support structures in the aftermath. Conversations that once revolved around practice, film, or game strategy now shifted to questions of purpose, future direction, and legacy. The contrast between the public perception of his career and his lived reality created tension. Fans, analysts, and former teammates continued to celebrate him for adaptability, resilience, and courage. But in private, he wrestled with questions that no headline could answer. Had all the sacrifice been worth it? Could he have played differently, specialized, or preserved himself better? Was his identity tied irrevocably to a system that ultimately discarded him? He also confronted the practical consequences of being a multi-positional player in free agency. Teams that had previously relied on him were hesitant to sign a player whose versatility, while remarkable, had created accumulated physical wear, and whose lack of a singular role complicated evaluation. Injuries were no longer theoretical. They were now historical liabilities. The absence of a defined position meant that prospective teams could not easily project his future contributions, nor assign him a clear place in a roster strategy. He was a paradox, proven in capability, yet uncertain in definition. The very quality that had once elevated him to legend now constrained his options. This period also highlighted the stark difference between public perception and structural reality. Media narratives framed the cut as inevitable, fans speculated on potential new teams, and commentators analyzed the decision through statistics and projections. Yet the human reality years of pain, adaptability, and sacrifice was largely invisible. He had been lauded for decades for his ability to absorb every need of the team, to play multiple positions, and to thrive under impossible demands. And yet, when the opportunity to continue contributing became a matter of business pragmatism, the value of his versatility evaporated. In the weeks following the cut, he began to understand the true cost of his career path. Being asked to play everything had shaped his legacy, yes, but it had also prevented him from cementing a singular, undeniable claim to a position, a role, or a clear identity. Specialization often provides stability. Versatility provides exposure. One yields financial security, team loyalty, and a clear measure of success. The other yields admiration, awe, and temporary indispensability. The league had rewarded his versatility publicly, but when it came to survival, it offered no safety net. The abruptness of being cut crystallized the reality that his sacrifices had, in structural terms, produced vulnerability. By the end of that period, he had to confront a brutal truth. In professional football, there is no reward for being everything, only consequences. The system prizes specialization, measurability, and clear identity, leaving those who transcend conventional roles exposed when their utility is no longer immediate. Career, marked by brilliance, adaptability, and heroism, had ended not with scandal or failure, but with a business decision that rendered him surplus to requirement. It was a final lesson in the harsh realities of a league that celebrates sacrifice but ultimately quantifies value in numbers, roles, and position-specific excellence. For years, he had lived as a man without boundaries, playing every role, absorbing every demand, and stretching the limits of mind and body. The abrupt removal from the team served as an unambiguous statement. Versatility alone cannot sustain a career when the system evolves beyond need. The extraordinary journey that had defined him from youth sports to collegiate stardom. Two NFL multi-positional hero had arrived at an ending both stark and instructive. But lacking the security reserved for players with singular roles, measurable statistics, or high-profile fame. Signing bonuses and deferred incentives had been modest. Now, without a team, the regular paychecks stopped, leaving him to navigate obligations that had always seemed manageable within the predictable cadence of a football season. And the reality hit with stark force. Financial stress compounded emotional strain. For decades, his identity had been inextricably linked to performance. He had defined himself through the lens of contribution, through the lens of the man who could play every position, fill every gap, and carry the team in emergencies. When that platform vanished, he was confronted with a void. Who was he if he was no longer the indispensable player? The body that had been pushed to physical extremes no longer had a stage, and the mental structure he had built around competition and utility crumbled in the absence of purpose. Loss of identity became an ever-present weight, haunting both waking hours and restless nights. Isolation deepened the spiral. Teammates who had once relied on him and shared victories now moved on, signing with other teams or embracing specialized roles that secured their own futures. Locker room camaraderie, which had previously provided affirmation and belonging, evaporated. Friends in the league offered support, but there were limits. They could empathize, advise, and offer encouragement. Yet they could not restore the platform on which he had defined his life. This isolation was both social and psychological. He was physically removed from the routines that had given structure, emotionally distanced from peers who now inhabited different trajectories, and mentally displaced from the identity he had cultivated for years. The spiral was not only internal, external perception amplified the weight. Fans still marveled at his adaptability. Sports media occasionally revisited the Swiss Army knife narrative, and analysts analyzed his previous feats with admiration. Yet none of these acknowledgments translated into immediate opportunity or stability. Praise became distant echo rather than actionable support. He was lauded for accomplishments now in the past tense, reminders of what he had done rather than recognition of what he could still contribute. The public mythologized him, but myth cannot pay bills, cannot mend injuries, and cannot replace the structure of daily purpose. Psychologically, the adjustment was brutal. A lifetime of defined roles, schedules, and expectations had instilled habits of discipline, resilience, and adaptability. These traits, while useful, could not mitigate the existential challenge of release. He experienced recurring doubts. Had versatility been his greatest strength, or his undoing? Had the relentless commitment to adaptability cost him not only physical well-being, but also the opportunity for stability and legacy? The questions were unanswerable in the moment, lingering like persistent echoes, and they deepened both anxiety and disorientation. Physical strain added another layer of complexity. Years of playing every position had left the body in varying states of decay. Knees, shoulders, back, and joints bore the accumulated toll of collisions, overuse, and strain. Medical concerns, previously managed within the structure of team resources, now required independent attention and financial commitment. Pain became a daily companion. A reminder that the cost of a career spent being indispensable was permanent and inescapable. Even rest could not undo decades of accumulated trauma. And the realization intensified the psychological burden of career loss. Attempts to seek employment elsewhere in the league were fraught with challenges. Teams were hesitant to invest in a player whose versatility had masked injury risks and whose lack of singular mastery complicated projection. He was simultaneously overqualified in breadth, yet undervalued in depth. The paradox of being too versatile to define meant that recruiters could not easily categorize him, could not project metrics for salary, performance, or durability, and therefore treated him cautiously. Opportunities were scarce, short-term, and often conditional, further reinforcing a sense of marginalization. Isolation extended beyond the professional sphere. Social circles had revolved around teammates, training routines, and shared competitive experiences. Conversations about football carried reminders of absence. Success was framed in past tense, and daily routines no longer aligned with those of the friends and peers he had known. The world he had inhabited for decades had shifted without him, leaving him disoriented in both identity and community. The spiral was cyclical. Financial strain amplified psychological pressure. Mental strain heightened sensitivity to physical pain. Isolation intensified feelings of inadequacy and displacement. The longer he remained disconnected from the structure, competition, and identity that football had provided, the more pronounced the spiral became. Attempts at rehabilitation, training, or networking were complicated by lingering injuries, emotional fatigue, and the frustration of navigating a system that valued specialization over versatility. In private reflection, he recognized the irony that defined his career, the very qualities that had elevated him to legend: adaptability, endurance, and the capacity to perform across multiple positions were now factors that complicated recovery, employment, and identity restoration. Versatility had created both opportunity and vulnerability. It had defined him as indispensable, but it had also left him without a clear anchor when the system no longer required his breath. The consequences of a career spent everywhere and nowhere simultaneously were now impossible to ignore. This period underscored the fragility of identity tied solely to performance. He was not a man who had failed. He was a man whose structural value within the league had been exhausted. His narrative was not one of moral failing or lack of effort, but of systemic reality. In a culture that measures worth by defined roles, measurable impact, and projection for the future, being everything and fitting nowhere leaves a person acutely exposed when the system evolves past need. The spiral after release was a stark lesson in the limits of adaptability without boundary, heroism without security, and identity built on utility alone. As the weeks and months passed, he began to confront the challenge of redefining selfhood outside the confines of the field. Financial management, injury rehabilitation, mental recalibration, and social reintegration became immediate concerns. Each day required negotiation between past identity and present reality, between public myth and private struggle, and between the pride of contribution and the humility of reinvention. The spiral, while painful, was also a catalyst for reflection. forcing a reckoning with the personal cost of a career spent being indispensable across every conceivable role. The desire to return is instinctual for professional athletes. For him, the drive to come back was not about ego alone. It was about reclaiming agency, proving that versatility still had value, and asserting that a man who had given everything still had something left to contribute. Yet the path to return was fraught with obstacles, both tangible and invisible, and the system that had once relied on him was now indifferent, if not skeptical. Rehabilitation became a full-time pursuit. He dedicated hours to physical therapy, repairing damage accumulated over years of playing every position. Knees that had absorbed tackle after tackle required meticulous care. Shoulders that had borne the brunt of blocks, hits, and dives needed rebuilding. He worked with trainers, specialists, and medical advisors, following regimented routines aimed at restoring not only strength, but also the subtle stability required for performance at the highest level. Every day was measured, disciplined, and painfully methodical, a stark contrast to the adrenaline-driven chaos of game days that had once defined him. Training alone became both a necessity and a metaphor for his career. Without a team structure or position-specific coaching, he had to simulate scenarios across multiple roles. Each session reminded him of the depth of knowledge he had mastered across the field, yet also exposed vulnerabilities. His body no longer responded with the fluidity it once had. Injuries flared unpredictably, and endurance was limited by cumulative wear. Being skilled in everything created uncertainty in projection. Could he sustain performance? Could he survive a full season? Could he offer measurable value when his utility could not be defined within a singular framework? The questions were logical from a managerial perspective, yet devastating from the standpoint of a player whose life had been built on transcendence of conventional roles. Networking within the league yielded similar frustrations. Former coaches and teammates offered encouragement, but encouragement could not override structural limitations. Roster constraints, salary caps, and an emphasis on specialized excellence meant that even extraordinary breadth was difficult to monetize or deploy. The very qualities that had once made him indispensable were now the reasons teams hesitated to invest in him. It was a paradox that had haunted his career. To be everything was to risk being nothing in the eyes of those who measured worth through defined metrics. Psychologically, the process was isolating. Watching younger single-position athletes rise while he struggled to regain footing was humbling. He confronted both envy and self-doubt, questioning whether his approach to the game sacrificing specialization for adaptability had inadvertently constrained the longevity of his career. Every rejection carried dual weight, a practical denial of opportunity and an existential reminder that the identity he had cultivated through versatility was now under threat. The emotional labor of repeated attempts to return became as taxing as the physical regimen itself. Media coverage during this period was inconsistent. Past feats were celebrated, and he remained a figure of intrigue. The Swiss Army knife of the league, analysts called him, but these narratives had little impact on concrete opportunity. Public fascination did not translate into contracts, starting roles, or even tryouts. He was a celebrated relic, an admired anomaly, but in terms of practical career revival, those accolades were intangible. The contrast between legend and utility became increasingly stark. He had once been indispensable on the field. Now, he was a cautionary figure in an industry that measures players by clearly defined contributions. Efforts to modify strategy and redefine focus emerged. He experimented with concentrating on a narrower set of positions, attempting to convince teams of his ability to specialize after years of breadth. Yet the transition was not seamless. Muscles conditioned for constant positional switching struggled to adapt to focused training. Cognitive patterns honed over years of absorbing multiple playbooks and situational awareness were difficult to recalibrate. The paradox persisted. He had been exceptional precisely because he could operate across roles. But he could no longer sustain that capacity physically, and specialization required him to abandon the very instincts that had defined him. Tryouts, when they came, were high stakes and emotionally charged. Scouts watched closely, weighing potential against risk. And he felt the implicit calculation that his value was now conditional. Versatility that had once been a celebrated asset was now an unpredictable variable, complicating assessments and diminishing opportunities. The mental toll of repeated rejection compounded physical fatigue. Months of preparation, countless hours of solo training, and relentless self-discipline were met with polite declines or cautious interest. Each response, while professionally standard, was psychologically devastating. The cycle of hope and disappointment echoed, a rhythm he had never experienced in a career built on constant action and immediate feedback. He wrestled with frustration, guilt for time spent, and lingering questions about whether his approach to adaptability had ultimately created a professional ceiling. Despite setbacks, he refused to concede entirely. Attempts to join practice squads, temporary contracts, or even coaching roles were explored. Every avenue required negotiation of identity, capability, and credibility. Even in these pursuits, the theme of being everywhere but nowhere persisted. Teams valued experience, knowledge, and toughness, but hesitated at the ambiguity of measurement. He was a paradox. Historically brilliant, physically tested, mentally resilient, yet uncertain in projected utility. This duality defined the period of attempted return, making every opportunity simultaneously promising and precarious. Through the months, he confronted the unrelenting reality. Football, the game he had defined himself by, had moved forward without him. Younger players had secured their roles. The league had shifted emphasis toward specialization, and his own body bore the physical evidence of decades of extreme adaptability. The attempts at comeback illuminated not only his determination, but the systemic limitations placed on a player whose career defied conventional categorization. His narrative was exceptional, but the system had no structural accommodation for such exceptionality once the immediate utility diminished. By the end of this period, he understood that a comeback would require recalibration not only physically, but conceptually. Success could no longer rely solely on breadth, sacrifice, or versatility. Survival in the league demanded defined value, measurable contribution, and positional identity. The attempts, while honorable and courageous, highlighted a stark truth. Being a player who could do everything had no guaranteed pathway to return once the league's metrics no longer aligned with such breadth. The struggle itself became a lesson in both personal resilience and the harsh structural realities of professional sports. The world outside football does not pause for a fallen athlete. Once defined by adrenaline, strategy, and constant engagement, life without purpose or structure can become a relentless weight. For him, the aftermath of release and the failed attempts at comeback precipitated a profound personal collapse. Touching every corner of existence, family, health, and identity, all unraveled under the pressure of displacement. What had once been a life of structure, clarity, and recognition became fragmented, chaotic, and deeply isolating. Family life, always challenged by the demands of an NFL career, began to fracture under the strain of uncertainty and absence of role. Long seasons, cross-country travel, and physical exhaustion had already created tension in personal relationships, but now the pressure intensified. Emotional volatility, lingering frustration, and the internalized grief of loss were no longer contained by a locker room or a structured training schedule. The invisible load of identity, lost and purpose deferred, spilled into interactions with loved ones. Conversations that had once centered on support and celebration turned tense and fraught. His partner, children, or immediate family witnessed a man struggling to reconcile the public myth of achievement with private despair. Emotional distance grew where closeness had once existed, creating unspoken rifts that exacerbated feelings of isolation. Health issues, both physical and mental, accelerated the collapse. Injuries accumulated over years of playing multiple positions. Once managed through team medical staff and rigorous routines, now became chronic, unmanaged conditions. Knees, shoulders, and back joints, weakened by decades of extremes, demanded attention and intervention beyond what he could self-administer. Chronic pain, limited activity, disrupted sleep, and compounded fatigue. Alongside physical deterioration came the hidden toll of mental strain, anxiety. Depression and a pervasive sense of failure took root, intensified by the relentless comparison to past capacity and the visible success of peers who had specialized and thrived. The dual burden of physical pain and mental anguish created a feedback loop, each exacerbating the other, leaving him trapped in a downward spiral. Financial insecurity contributed to the collapse as well. Years of unstable contracts, compounded by the absence of a team and the unsuccessful attempts at comeback, strained resources. Medical bills, household obligations, and the looming pressures of long-term planning created stress that became inescapable. Unlike teammates with high-profile contracts or positional clarity, he had no clear path to leverage his previous career into sustained financial security. The volatility of earnings and the necessity of funding rehabilitation, healthcare, and daily living created constant anxiety, a reminder that the sacrifices of a versatile career had not produced lasting protection. Isolation became both a symptom and amplifier of the collapse. Former teammates, coaches, and colleagues had moved forward. Professional networks that once provided camaraderie or mentorship had evolved to focus on younger talent or singularly specialized players. Attempts at connection, while sometimes welcomed, could not replicate the immersive environment that had defined his career. The loss of social scaffolding, combined with family strain and personal injury, reinforced the sense of being adrift in a world that had once revolved around skill, contribution, and identity. Solitude, once a rare companion, became a daily reality, magnifying both physical and psychological pain. Public perception offered no solace. Fans and media continued to celebrate past achievements, framing him as a heroic anomaly, yet these narratives were abstract, intangible, and incapable of mitigating the daily hardships of survival and rehabilitation. Recognition became symbolic rather than functional. Applause from the stands could not pay bills, treat injuries, or restore identity. The dissonance between public myth and private reality intensified feelings of invisibility and failure. Despite the extraordinary career that had preceded this period of collapse, self-reflection during this period was unrelenting. He confronted questions that had no easy answers, had the choices that defined his career, embracing every position, sacrificing specialization, prioritizing team need over personal health been worth the cost. Could he have preserved a singular identity while maintaining excellence? Was the collapse inevitable, given the structural realities of professional football? The answers offered little comfort. Every reflection circled back to the paradox that had defined his life. Versatility had been both his strength and his undoing, leaving him uniquely exposed when the system no longer required him. Mental health struggles became acute. Anxiety, depressive episodes, and the pervasive feeling of invisibility shadowed every day. Routine tasks became laborious. Decision-making was impaired by stress and fatigue. He experienced a profound disconnection between his previous life of constant action and the current reality of inactivity and uncertainty. The contrast was stark. The man who had once thrived under pressure, who had executed split-second decisions across multiple positions, now confronted the relentless weight of stillness, indecision, and perceived irrelevance. The fall extended into identity itself. For decades, he had defined self-worth through adaptability, utility, and contribution. Without a team, without a position, without a clear function, the architecture of identity began to crumble. Past accolades, statistical anomalies, and media praise offered little in the face of practical, daily reality. The cognitive dissonance between being celebrated as a legend and living as a man struggling to find footing was disorienting and demoralizing. The internal dialogue became increasingly critical, questioning the very choices that had built a career of unparalleled versatility. Attempts at stabilization therapy, mentorship, rehabilitation programs forward a partial relief, but the collapse was systemic. The intersection of physical injury, financial pressure, relational strain, and loss of purpose created a multidimensional crisis that could not be addressed by any single intervention. Each area of life reflected the others. Financial strain exacerbated emotional instability. Injury limited mobility and independence, and social isolation magnified both physical and psychological vulnerability. The convergence of these pressures represented the most acute challenge of his adult life. Despite the depth of the collapse, traces of resilience persisted. Memories of past victories, moments of physical mastery, and recognition from fans and peers provided intermittent psychological scaffolding. He clung to the knowledge that he had performed at a level few could achieve, that he had redefined the boundaries of versatility, and that the sacrifices, though costly, had created a narrative of bravery and endurance. These fragments of pride, though insufficient to restore equilibrium fully, were anchors in the midst of a storm. The period of personal collapse illustrates a harsh truth about professional sports, achievement, and versatility, even at the highest level. Offer no guarantees against the structural realities of employment, identity, and physical decline. A man who could do everything, who had embodied the ideal of adaptability, was not insulated from the consequences of systemic impermanence. Family strain, deteriorating health, and social isolation converged to create a crucible that tested both spirit and body. The collapse was not simply the end of a career, was a comprehensive confrontation with the consequences of extreme versatility in a world that ultimately values specialization, measurable impact, and positional identity over breadths of contribution. By the conclusion of this period, he was forced to reckon with the totality of loss, not just of position, team, or financial security, but of self-concept, relationships, and physical well-being. The man who had played every position, who had been celebrated as indispensable, now faced the starkest reality of his life. The structures that had defined success and identity had vanished, leaving only the challenge of rebuilding in a world that no longer measured value by the qualities he had embodied for decades. It was a nadir, both personal and existential, marking the end of one chapter and the unprepared beginning of another. There comes a point in the life of every athlete when denial, hope, and struggle give way to a stark clarity. For him, that point arrived quietly, in the empty hours of reflection after years of tumult, adaptation, and sacrifice. The adrenaline of the game, the chaos of multiple positions, and the endless pressure to fill every role had once obscured the cumulative cost. Now, in the silence of personal reckoning, he confronted the full measure of what he had given, what he had endured, and what he had lost. This was the moment when illusion faded, and the truth of a career defined by versatility could no longer be ignored. The first part of the truth was undeniably physical. Every joint, tendon, and muscle bore the record of relentless service. Knees were stiff with arthritis. Shoulders and elbows screamed with chronic inflammation. And the back, always taxed by the uneven burdens of positions, switching, limited movement, and mobility. Pain was no longer a temporary hurdle. It had become a constant, insistent presence, a daily reminder of the price exacted by a career spent being indispensable in every capacity. The body that had once carried him across fields, absorbing hits meant for others, executing plays in every formation, now spoke in blunt, unyielding language. The third component was relational. Family, friends, teammates, and colleagues had been peripheral witnesses to the unfolding of his career. Yet now their distance, inevitable as it was, underscored a painful truth. The life of extreme versatility isolates. Relationships had been shaped around practice schedules, game days, and the identity of the player who could do it all. Now, removed from the field, those structures were gone. Emotional support existed, but it could not replace the sense of belonging that comes from contributing visibly to a collective goal. The loneliness was profound, layered, and unavoidable. Amidst these dimensions, reflection turned inward and outward simultaneously. Inward, he confronted the personal choices that had shaped a career of extremes. The commitment to every position, the willingness to absorb injuries and risk, the constant prioritization of team need over personal health. Outward, he examines the structure of professional football itself, a system that rewards specialization, measurable contribution, and positional mastery, yet exploits the adaptability of players until it discards them. The contradiction was stark and uncomfortable. The system celebrates the myth of the heroic, versatile player, while providing no long-term protection or recognition for the physical and emotional costs incurred. Versatility becomes both exaltation and vulnerability, heroism and exploitation. He began to quantify, in memory and in feeling, the human cost. Nights spent in rehabilitation rather than with family. Days of chronic pain endured for moments of fleeting glory. Injuries masked by adrenaline and expectation. Skills acquired across the field, yet none defining him enough to ensure security. The tally was invisible to the public, unrecorded in statistics, yet it defined his lived reality. Adaptability, which had once opened doors, had simultaneously created a career path without safety net, a life where contribution was applauded but not protected. Acceptance emerged gradually. It was not resignation, but recognition. A clear-eyed understanding of the consequences of a career built on breadth rather than depth. He could acknowledge the sacrifices, honor the moments of brilliance, and still recognize that the structural realities of professional football had exacted a price. The acceptance was dual. He could no longer return to the field as he had been, and he could no longer ignore the long-term toll of a life spent in perpetual adaptation. The clarity was painful, but liberating. In acknowledging truth, he reclaimed agency over narrative, reflection, and next steps. At the same time, he reflected on the broader system. Football prizes specialization, both for individual development and for the efficiency of team management. A player defined by a single position has measurable value, predictable impact, and a clear place within the hierarchy. Versatile players, meanwhile, become indispensable in emergencies, celebrated for heroics. yet often denied the protections, role stability, or long-term planning granted to their specialized peers. The human cost of the Swiss Army knife mentality becomes visible only in stories like his, where the gap between public admiration and structural security is unbridgeable. This moment of truth also illuminated the paradox of heroism and vulnerability. He had lived the ideal of team-first commitment, and yet the system rewarded those who specialized, measured, and projected, leaving the versatile player exposed to the consequences of breadth without depth. Reflection became both cathartic and instructive. In looking back, he could trace the trajectory: early athleticism, multi-sport success, collegiate versatility, the drafting confusion, the pressure of playing every role, injuries, media mythologization, eventual release, personal collapse, and attempts at comeback. Each phase reinforced a single pattern: the tension between individual capability and systemic valuation. Talent, endurance, and adaptability had elevated him, yet structural expectations, specialization, and risk assessment had ultimately defined his fate. The narrative was not simply about loss, it was about the unforgiving logic of a system that cannot accommodate exceptionality when exceptionality defies measurement. In this moment, he also understood the legacy. Public memory would remember him as a marvel, a Swiss Army knife, a player who could do everything. Friends and analysts would celebrate feats and extraordinary moments. Yet the personal understanding of that legacy carried weight beyond recognition. It included the cost of identity, physical sacrifice, relational strain, and the systemic exposure of being indispensable, yet unprotected. This nuanced understanding provided both clarity and caution, framing his life and career as a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the paradox of human adaptability in a system designed for categorization. Finally, the moment of truth brought with it a form of reconciliation. Acceptance allowed him to integrate past glory with present limitation, to recognize value beyond current employment, and to redefine self-worth beyond immediate utility. It illuminated the duality of his journey: a man extraordinary in capacity, yet human in vulnerability; celebrated in public, yet structurally exposed; heroic in execution, yet challenged by systemic imperatives. The recognition of these truths, though sobering, became a lens through which he could examine both personal and structural realities, gaining insight that had eluded him during the chaos of a career lived at the extreme edge of adaptability. In that clarity, the narrative of a man who had played every position, sacrificed endlessly, and endured the unquantifiable costs of versatility found coherence. The story was no longer only about the collapse, the injuries, or the personal trials. It was about understanding the invisible architecture of professional sports, the cost of adaptability, and the reality of a system that applauds sacrifice in the moment but measures value in narrow definitions of contribution. He could face the truth, accept the consequences, and find meaning beyond the immediate metrics of performance or recognition. Legacy is an elusive concept in professional sports. For most, it is measured in championships, statistics, or accolades. For him, legacy was defined less by numbers and more by the extraordinary extremes of sacrifice, adaptability, and endurance. He was the player who had done it all, who had run every route, absorbed every hit, and stepped into every role demanded by circumstance. And yet, in doing so, he paid a hidden price few ever saw. His story is a cautionary tale, a chronicle of brilliance shadowed by the structural realities of a league that prizes specialization over adaptability. systems over humanity, and efficiency over sacrifice. Looking at NFL history, he occupies a unique, almost paradoxical position. The league has always celebrated versatility players like Chuck Bednarik, who excelled on both offense and defense, or Deion Sanders, whose dual roles made him legendary. More recently, Julian Edelman transitioned from quarterback in college to a wide receiver in the pros, carving a niche through adaptability. But the difference with him was extremity. No other player in the modern era had been required to perform across so many positions consistently, week after week, as a central function of his employment. His skill set made him indispensable in emergencies, but it also left him perpetually exposed. Without a single role to anchor identity, career progression, or financial security. In a system built for predictability, his exceptionalism became both asset and liability. The cautionary element of his story is profound. Teams exploited the value of his adaptability without fully appreciating or mitigating the cost. Every injury absorbed, every play executed out of positional necessity. Every night spent in rehab for body parts that had never been allowed to heal fully was a transaction in a ledger invisible to public perception. Coaches celebrated versatility as a tactical advantage, but rarely shielded him from cumulative damage. Contracts rarely reflected the totality of his contribution, focusing instead on quantifiable performance in isolated moments. In short, the league leveraged his breadth while failing to account for the depth of consequence. Yet the human aspect of this legacy is equally important. To understand his life, one must grasp the intersection of personal ambition and systemic expectation. He wanted to succeed. He wanted to help his team. He wanted to extend his career and find relevance. But the very qualities that facilitated opportunity, physical bravery, mental acuity, and adaptability simultaneously increased vulnerability. He sacrificed health, stability, and, ultimately, career longevity to fill gaps others could not. This is a reality often hidden behind statistics, highlight reels, and media narratives. The glory is visible. The cost is less so. And it is that hidden ledger of physical, emotional, and relational debt that shapes the cautionary dimension of his legacy. In analyzing his story, one sees a pattern that is rarely articulated but widely experienced in the league. The most versatile players are often celebrated as heroes, particularly in the immediacy of success. Fans cheer when a wide receiver fills in at cornerback, when a running back completes a punt return, or when a linebacker steps in at fullback for an emergency drive. These moments generate headlines, memes, and admiration. Yet the system rarely ensures that these players have long-term protection. Positional labeling, contract structures, and injury mitigation are oriented toward specialization. The adaptable man, the one who gives everything to every role, is paradoxically exposed, valued in the moment, discarded when no longer optimal. His story illuminates that paradox more vividly than almost any other in NFL history. There is also an emotional legacy to consider. To be the most useful man on the team is to inhabit a position of constant pressure, invisibility, and expectation. Recognition is conditional, often transient, and frequently overshadowed by those whose singular mastery is easier to quantify. He was a hero in action, a linchpin in crises, and a player whose name became synonymous with flexibility. But the accolades were fleeting. When the season ended, when the injuries piled up, or when the contracts expired, the narrative shifted. The emotional toll of being celebrated only in episodic crises and invisible in the structure of long-term planning created a silent burden that accompanied every step of his career and lingered long after it ended. His legacy also carries lessons for the league, teams, and future players. It underscores the need for structural consideration of versatility as a measurable value beyond immediate tactical advantage. Teams can no longer treat adaptability as an exploitable edge without accounting for the hidden cost: cumulative injuries, mental strain, relational strain, and career fragility. Contracts, medical protection, and career counseling should reflect the unique demands placed on players who serve in multiple capacities. In essence, his story challenges the NFL to reconcile admiration for extraordinary versatility with the ethical and practical imperatives of long-term protection and sustainability. From a historical perspective, his career is a mirror to the evolution of the league. In early decades, two-way players and positional fluidity were more common. Necessity drove adaptability. As the NFL evolved, specialization, financial structure, and analytic measurement became dominant. Players who were everything to everyone became rarer and more precarious. He embodies that transitional tension, the last generation to operate across extremes, yet exposed in a system increasingly built for predictability and specialization. His experience highlights a structural imbalance, a hidden cost encoded into the league's evolution that few outside the inner circle fully understand. There is also a cultural lesson embedded in his story. Professional sports often valorize sacrifice, endurance, and selflessness. Players are lauded for pushing through pain, for prioritizing team over self, and for exceeding limits. Yet the culture of heroism rarely accounts for the aftermath. His narrative exposes a dissonance. Society celebrates the giving of everything in the moment, but seldom acknowledges or compensates for the long-term human consequences. His life forces a reconsideration of the unspoken contract between player and system, one that often prioritizes spectacle over sustainability. In reflecting on the personal dimension, the human cost is unavoidable. Relationships strained by long seasons and injuries, physical health compromised by relentless adaptation, and mental health challenged by relentless pressure all paint a portrait of a man who gave everything and received only partial acknowledgement in return. The story is tragic in scale, yet instructive in clarity. It forces an understanding that excellence and utility, when untethered from systemic support and role definition, can produce consequences as profound as any visible injury or statistical anomaly. Finally, his legacy is an invitation to remember the human behind the heroics. He was not merely a Swiss Army knife or a headline. He was a man whose extraordinary capacity to adapt, endure, and perform revealed both the brilliance and vulnerability inherent in professional sports. His story challenges us to reconsider how we value players, not only in what they do in the moment, but in how we protect, support, and honor them over a lifetime. To understand his legacy is to grasp the unseen ledger of cost, the quiet toll of giving too much, and the cautionary lesson embedded in every extraordinary, adaptable career. The life of a man who played every position, who gave everything, and who lost so much cannot be reduced to statistics, highlight reels, or fleeting acclaim. It endures in the lessons he imparts, the structural realities of the league, the hidden costs of adaptability, and the human consequences of being indispensable in ways that defy conventional measurement. His legacy is both a marvel and a warning, a narrative of brilliance shadowed by sacrifice, and an enduring reminder that being everything to everyone often comes at the cost of everything to oneself. His story is not just the story of one man, 'tis the story of the NFL itself, a league built on precision, specialization, and the relentless measurement of performance. From the moment a player steps into the stadium, he is not only an athlete, but also a node in a complex system designed for efficiency, hierarchy, and predictability. That system rewards excellence in defined roles, quantifiable impact, and the ability to fit neatly into a positional construct. It is unforgiving to those who refuse or fail to fit those parameters. He refused, by necessity, to fit. He became a player without a position, a man who could do everything, and yet, in the end, belonged nowhere. The lesson of his journey begins with understanding the invisible machinery of the NFL. Teams, coaches, and analysts rely on specialization because it reduces risk and maximizes control. Each position has a playbook, a metric for performance, and an expected physical and mental profile. When a player transcends one role, when he is asked to inhabit multiple positions at once, he challenges that architecture. For a time, such a player appears heroic, indispensable, even irreplaceable. But the system was never designed to sustain him. In fact, it is structured to exploit him. The league leverages his adaptability in emergencies, praises him in moments of crisis, and relies on him to patch every gap. Yet when the season ends, when contracts are negotiated, when youth and specialization are prioritized, that same adaptability becomes a liability. There is no long-term plan, no protection, and no path to stability. His value is both celebrated and erased, a paradox that underpins the harsh realities of professional football. This structural paradox is inseparable from the emotional toll he endured. Identity, for most players, is entwined with position, mastery, and the clarity of contribution. Quarterbacks are quarterbacks. Receivers are receivers. Linemen are linemen. These identities anchor social dynamics, career trajectory, and self-perception. For him, there was no anchor. He was everywhere, yet nowhere. Needed constantly, yet claimed by none. His adaptability, once a source of pride, became a source of existential strain. The emotional cost of never belonging fully to one unit, never having a singular role, was profound. It manifested in isolation, in burnout, in the relentless questioning of self-worth. To be indispensable to everyone and claimed by no one is to exist perpetually on the periphery, even in a room full of teammates, fans, and analysts. The physical reality mirrored the emotional truth. Every injury, every collision, every strain accrued in multiple dimensions across his body. While a player specialized in a single position might focus recovery, rehabilitation, and training on specific movements and risks, he confronted every conceivable demand. Knees taxed by sudden lateral movement one play, shoulders bruised from repeated hits on the next, back and joints stressed by unrelenting positional shifts. The cumulative effect was not linear, was compounding, unpredictable, and ultimately career-defining. Versatility, the very trait that made him valuable, also made him vulnerable. The system rewarded action in the moment, but provided no mechanism to mitigate the long-term consequences. The toll of adaptability, invisible to fans and media, was both immediate and enduring, a silent ledger of sacrifice. Financially, his trajectory reflected the paradox of the versatile player. Contracts are often negotiated based on measurable production, positional metrics, and statistical output. When a player stretches across multiple roles, the valuation becomes ambiguous. He had contributed in ways that were remarkable, yet the system lacked the metrics to justify commensurate compensation. Teams, prioritizing clarity and specialization, undervalued him. Despite the breadth of his contribution, he lacked the leverage of a singular identity, the bargaining power of a measurable role. Versatility, so celebrated in the moment, became a mechanism for underpayment, undervaluation, and eventual displacement. The financial reality mirrored the structural one. To be indispensable in every capacity is to be replaceable when quantification matters more than adaptability. Perhaps most poignantly, his journey illuminates the personal cost of a system that conflates heroism with exploitation. He was lauded in headlines, celebrated by teammates, and mythologized in highlight reels as a Swiss Army knife of talent. Yet that very praise concealed a profound truth. The recognition was episodic, the admiration conditional, and the protection absent. The league, media, and fans saw the heroic figure, the one who could answer every call, perform under pressure, and fill every gap. They did not see the physical pain endured silently, the mental strain of constant adaptation, or the erosion of identity and stability. His story is a reminder that public recognition often obscures private cost.